Professor Kevin Sullivan, thank you very much for coming on to the show today. I think you have so much knowledge and so much information and so much wisdom to offer my audience and me. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So again, thank you.
No, thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind words. So
absolutely. So I have a few notes here. I don't like to look at my notes too much, but you have graduate degrees from the University of Notre Dame, the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, the University of Michigan, and the University of Oxford. You're extremely educated and well qualified to talk about what we're going to talk about today. That's the origins of Christianity, some Judaism, history, a lot of religious things in the broader scope, I guess. Really quick, could you just tell me briefly about your education process, the genesis of your education?
Sure.
Because it's impressive.
Oh, thank you. In my undergraduate, I started in economics and I finished that degree actually, but I double majored and I found a course for distribution credit called Jesus and the Gospels. And I took that course and I got an A, and I thought that was really interesting. And so I kept going in that field, and that's how I wound up double majoring in biblical studies and economics, which is probably the only person my year that did that or ever. But then I was sort of finished my undergraduate degree and was thinking, do I go, into graduate school and follow this? Do I go get a job? And I got into the University of Notre Dame, and I went from there and took off. And so then that degree is in ancient Judaism and Christianity. And then I finished that degree in like a year and a half. And I went to one of my professors and said, well, I'm done and I want to pursue this. And he's like, well, you don't actually have enough time. You haven't learned Hebrew well enough yet. And I said, well, how do I get into a PhD program? How do I do more study? And I still have the pamphlet. The professor wrote a Post-it note and he gave it to me in my mailbox, telling me about the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. So that's why I wound up there for a year and studied Judaism broadly, right? Both modern and ancient Judaism and Hebrew, the ancient language of Hebrew and so on. And so then I completed that. And I was trying to figure out what I would do next. And I already had connections with the University of Michigan because I'd gone there as an undergrad. So I went and started a PhD program there.
You started? Oh, you didn't found? You just
No.
began.
Yeah, I began my PhD studies. Yeah, to be more specific. Yeah, so I began my PhD studies there, but it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. One of which was a professor who I went to work with wound up leaving the institution. And so then I had, made some connections with the professors at Oxford through the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, which at the time was something of a separate entity, but now has been more sort of fully absorbed into Oxford. Mm-hmm. But then, then I went and applied and got in and did my PhD at Oxford. So I'm finished in 2000. Well, I finished my dissertation in 2002 and then finished the degree itself and all the, defense and all that in 2003.
So you technically became a doctor at Oxford in what precisely?
So it's a doctorate in theology, but that's the field. But it's my specific study throughout is really biblical studies, and with a focus on Second Temple Judaism. So that's sort of 200 BCE to about 100 CE or BC and AD. So right through so Judaism prior to and right through the time of Jesus and early Christianity through Paul and the writing of the New Testament was my area of specialization. Really throughout all those degrees, even though they sort of moved around that and studied different things that supported it and so on.
Okay, very fascinating. And before we move on, I just want to answer this question or get an answer to this question right out the gate. You have a plethora of knowledge of Christianity, the origins of it, of Judaism, the origins of that, and maybe how that became Christianity. We'll talk about that all in a second.
Sure.
Given that knowledge, are you a religious man now? And if you are, what denomination do you consider yourself a member of?
Yeah, no, good question. And I've always prided myself on the students not being able to tell. So I would consider myself religious. I was raised Catholic. Right. And
I'm not surprised, actually.
Yeah. Kevin Patrick Sullivan. So, and went to Notre Dame. But I would say I'm still very religious in some senses, but at the same time, studying the Bible historically presents its own challenges to the way in which you can sort of I imagine over the years I've lost some students who came to my classes feeling that the idea that the Bible is something that is just sort of sacrosanct, you can't question anything in it, or that in any way it's a product of human, sort of institutions or human hands. And so that therein is something of a tension that makes it hard to be, the same kind of religious person that maybe a lot of people would imagine somebody with my training would be, because there's sort of this whole, having a historical context for it changes, I think, your perspective on the way in which you can certainly see the importance of all of it, but it changes a bit of your perspective on the way that the absolutism that you might find in some folks with regard to the Bible. So I would still say that I'm religious and in the Catholic tradition, but maybe lapsed Catholic as Catholics go. But yeah. Anyway.
Incredibly interesting. Okay. Well, no. You really got my mind going there, because I feel like I can resonate with you in a lot of ways there. And I've found myself in trouble. I'm a very I don't know how I want to say this without sounding conceited or anything or something else, but I'm very logical to a fault. I have always considered, and I might find myself in hot water at this, and I found myself, especially with Protestants, in hot water. So I look at the Bible. Tell me what you think the Bible is. When I look at the Bible, I think of it's a culmination. It's a collection of historical texts written up into the point of 382 A.D. There's a Council of Rome under Pope Damasus where they finally made the first canon, which Catholics still use today, which is why I'm very proud to be Catholic. It's at least the most logical, sane route to go, in my very humble opinion. But to me, it seems like a collection of books written by man and definitely inspired by the Holy Spirit or God. But a lot of people say that it's the divine word of God. And I think the terminology used there is important, because I don't look at the Bible as something like the Quran or even the Torah, to where it's like, you can't even drop this thing. It's like, this is God speaking on paper.
Yeah.
It's written by the hands of man. It's translated. There's a Protestant version that's missing 7 books. It can't necessarily be effectively written by the hand of God. What do you think the Bible is?
Yeah, well, we usually start my intro to Bible class with that question and work on it all semester. But I think you've done a pretty good job of capturing what I try to do in the class, which is explain that at the end of the day, what you have in front of you as a written text or printed text, right, or now electronic, is the product of many, many centuries of human effort, right? And so however far back you go and think about the inspiration that led to the origins of the text. So let's say Paul is inspired, Paul or John of Patmos or whoever, they're having a revelation. This is all inspired by God. It still winds up on pieces of papyrus, right, and things like that for many centuries are hand copied until, really into the, 15th century in the printing press, right? And then sort of it becomes a little more codified. And then finally, you get into, even later eras where, large numbers of people are literate and have means to, have a Bible of their own and read that Bible and so on. So there are an immense amount of human processes involved in the text that you read, no matter what you think about its origins and its inspiration. There really isn't much argument for or doubt in the idea that there are human hands in that process. So,
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And in what is the divine word of God truly is the Gospels, at least, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is a topic I want to talk about in the authorship of the Gospels. I think it's very fascinating. I don't think a lot of people know about it. But those, when you quote Jesus Christ and you believe he is truly the Son of God and God himself, the member of the Trinity, that would be the divine word of God. But a lot of the Bible is man saying things and recording what man is saying and believing that he is inspired by God. The 10 Commandments, I don't know if it's believed. First, is it believed that God carved into the rock the words, or do you think it's Moses heard the words, carved them into the rock? Just a random question. I know.
No, that's hard to say. I mean, I think that's later Jewish traditions think about moving well beyond what we would call the 10 Commandments into kind of all of Torah, right, of the Jewish law being all from God and being received on Sinai. So that depends a lot on your interpretive tradition. So I think that's probably left to the different communities that think about the importance of that. And you can see why that matters, though, right? So if someone was to sort of, from an argument standpoint, give the ground and say, okay, well, humans copied this text, but it's still from God. Well, then some of the stories about the way in which, prophets, Jesus, whoever received, or, people who were inspired like Paul or whatever, received that matter, right? Because the way in which you understand that they received the text. I mean, think about if you move to the Islamic tradition and Muhammad, right, as a prophet, right? And there's this important distinction there of him as some sort of intermediary, but not having written the text, right? Because the text can only come from Allah, from God, right? So there's ways in which the communities try to understand what is the source, right? Even if they're willing to concede that, yeah, there are hand copies, or this is a book or whatever in front of me, where is the sort of authority of the text? And so even in Jewish tradition, you can have the idea that the tablets were written. Yeah, and I think those are actually written, right? Moses carries them around, and they're carried around in the ark, to later Jewish communities thinking that far beyond what happened at Sinai being 10 commandments was all of the Jewish law that guides Jewish life even centuries later. So yeah, it depends on the community a lot that gives authority to the text in the way that they shape the text.
Got it. We are brought to you by Aftershock Decals and Design in Fairbury, Illinois. From business logos to building signs, Aftershock Decals and Designs in Fairbury creates graphics and prints that will make heads turn. If you need signage for any occasion, Aftershock's team of creative experts are virtually unlimited in their capabilities. They can create the highest quality full and partial vehicle wraps for cars, trucks, trailers, semis, and race cars, as well as small to massive banners for all occasions. They also do yard signs, decals, window perforations, stickers, custom logo designs, and much more. When you need to promote your business, develop your brand, or enhance your image, do it all with the area's most trusted graphic design company, Aftershock Decals and Design in Fairbury, Illinois. Give them a call at 833-332-2548 or pay them a visit at 116 East Locust Street in Fairbury. We are brought to you by Marshallone's Pizza in Fairbury, Illinois. Look, I'm a pizza enthusiast, a pizza savant. I know my pizza. Every time I'm in Fairbury, Illinois, or within 15 miles of Fairbury, I am ordering Marshallone's Pizza because Marshallone's Pizza is amazing. Not only that, they also offer a daily happy hour. So if you call between 4 and 5 p.m. and order a pizza, you get the second one of equal or lesser value for free. Restrictions apply. You can even call at 4:45 p.m. and order your pizzas, pick them up at 8 p.m. and you will still get that happy hour discount. How amazing is that? For the most delicious pizza around, head nowhere else but Marshallone's Pizza in Fairbury, Illinois. Call them up and place your order today at 815-692-4602 and pick it up at 405 East Locust Street in Fairbury, Illinois. Marshallone's Pizza. That's good pizza. Let's start from the beginning and just kind of go in chronological order, and I'm talking the beginning.
Okay.
When you look at the Old Testament, perhaps at a time, I imagine you were probably very religious in college. Is that fair to say? Or were you merely curious?
Probably less religious in college, because I think when I got to college and started seeing the sort of academic study of the Bible and that's sort of where the questioning starts, and maybe being religious in the sense of being, active in religious communities, that was lessened, I think, by that challenge, because that was really the start of that challenge, awakening, whatever you want to call it, of looking at the Bible in a very different kind of way than had received it in, family and church, community, whatever. So that shifted me. I'd say that was a time where I was very much away from being kind of part of institutional church.
I see. Okay. Real quick, before we continue, aim your thing just a little to your right.
To my right.
Yes, because I noticed you. So it's just like aiming right
Sounds
at
good.
you.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So starting with the beginning, looking in the Old Testament, Genesis, the beginning, do you think that those books, Genesis was written to be taken literally, in that in the beginning there was darkness on the face of the deep. It was nothing, and then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then do you think it took 7 days to create the earth? A lot of people I've argued with think that it did take 7 24-hour periods, truly. Do you think the Old Testament, specifically Genesis, is to be taken literally and was meant to be taken literally?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I know it's still debated. I mean, from my point of view and the study that I've done, and I would talk about it also too for those communities. I'd say the Hebrew Bible, right? So the Old Testament kind of gives it this perspective of through Christianity, and I understand that. So they're one and the same in some regards, but thinking about them, you said go back to the beginning. Well, those texts predate Christianity by centuries, right? Maybe more. And so they come out of traditions that are long before Christianity as we know it develops. And so what are those stories, in Genesis? What are they trying to capture? Well, they're thinking about existence, right? So how do human beings get where they are? And how do they get in the condition they're in? And that's, if you think of it that way, that's very much what Genesis is trying to answer. How do we get here? How do human beings come to be here and be self-aware and so on? And then secondarily, how do humans find themselves in the condition they're in? And so these are called etiologies, right? Stories of origin. And that's very much what Genesis is trying to do, is trying to answer those questions. And I imagine that those that thought about these things at the beginning and told those stories meant them fairly literally, right, at that time. But I don't know if they meant them to be transmitted in this way and then be taken literally thousands of years later through different lenses in different communities and so on, if that makes sense.
Do we have any idea of who authored these books?
Well, we would call them, Jews of an ancient era, right? So Judaism that even predates Moses in some regards, right? And so you have sort of people living in what we call the Holy Land, right? Even prior to the traditions that at some point it has to predate Moses, but it's all part of the Mosaic tradition, right? And so we don't get those books until the 5 books. Genesis is part of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. So it starts coming out of that formulation of the Mosaic tradition that's kind of foundational for Judaism. And so those, I imagine, are narratives, are stories. And when I say stories, I don't mean to be negative or condescending about them. They're just stories, right? They're each sort of unit within Genesis are fascinating tales, if you will, right? And I think they start as oral traditions, right? They're not being written down. I think when these are created or when they're coming out of communities, let's say they're as ancient as history itself, right? As long as humans are thinking about these kinds of questions, this is the origin story for this community. Well, they're telling it orally for a long time until they write it down. And then after they write it down and tie it to the Mosaic tradition, it starts to help them explain quite a bit more about who they are and how their situation is the way that it is, right? Because if you think about the Adam and Eve story, it's trying to explain the difficulty in some sense, of the human condition, right? So that why is it that humans, suffer the way that they do? Why do women suffer in childbirth? Why are humans mortal? All of those things. It's really, it's fascinating in very short order in the Bible, how many big questions it tries to tackle, if you think about it, in just 6 or 7 chapters, right? So
do you think it's worth noting, in psychology, the most referenced book is the Bible. It's absolutely stunning, to the point that you could assume some divine intervention just if you look at the Old Testament in a metaphorical sense. The lessons, the trueness of what it is saying in a metaphorical way is beyond profound. First of all, also in a little bit of a scientific lens too. I've always loved, in 1935, it was Father Georges Lemaitre, probably mispronouncing his name. He came up with the Big Bang Theory, him alongside Edwin Hubble. And he compared it to, I think, who was it? Not Pope John Paul II. It was someone before him. But he said to the Pope, hey, this kind of coexists very well with the story of creation. Let there be light, and there was light, and it was good. And I've thought that was very interesting. Maybe we'll touch on that in a second. But would you at least acknowledge that these Old Testament stories, altered they may be in antiquity, they, in their own way, in a metaphorical way, they do seem rather true. The lessons that they preach seem extremely useful and applicable to modern life. Would you agree with that? Or do you think that some of the messages that the Old Testament teaches aren't exactly so brilliant?
Good question. Pretty broad question, right? Because there's a lot in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. But
maybe we could start with just Genesis then?
Sure. Yeah. So I think they're profoundly valuable to communities that have inculcated them. So that is Western culture. I think they're really valuable narratives. Is there a way for them to still be powerful in a modern scientific age, like you're kind of what you're hinting at? Yes, I think that there is. I think there's a way in which, and I think there are still scholars on both sides in the scientific community and also psychology and so on that are looking at meditation, religious belief, prayer, and so on, and looking at it in new and different ways and taking it seriously, the way in which it impacts the human person, the mind, what it can do, and how it functions in community. So people have been looking at that for a long time. And so the answer is yes. The truth question is always really difficult, right? It's going to be individual, and then it'll be communal and within a community. And I think it can be extremely powerful within communities and still is. Is it an absolute truth? That's really difficult, right? And because we said we would talk a little bit about maybe other religions and things too. That gets very tricky. You move into outside of communities, but within, Judeo-Christian tradition, within Western civilization, it's proven that it's very important and valuable.
Yes, like that the bedrock of Western civilization and perhaps the greatest societies in the world. Do you think that they are founded on Judeo-Christian values and principles? Would you agree with that? Or do you think that's not necessarily the case? Maybe that's a little naive or too positive thinking of me. We are brought to you by Tri-County Carpet and Flooring Sales and Installation in Fairbury, Illinois. Tri-County Carpet and Flooring in Fairbury is the premier flooring store throughout Livingston, McLean, and Ford counties. From choosing the perfect flooring to measuring and installation, Tri-County ensures top quality products and services. Their trained professionals boast precise measurements, straight cuts, and perfect fits, while their showroom houses a multitude of gorgeous, top quality, name brand carpet and flooring options in the latest styles and colors that are durable and long lasting. With free estimates, design consultation, and contractor and multi-room discounts, Tri-County in Fairbury is your one-stop shop for all of your home and business flooring needs. Pay them a visit at 19 Jan Lane in Fairbury, Illinois, right off of Route 24, and give them a call at 815-692-3666.
Tri-County Carpet, your flooring paradise.
We are brought to you by Fairview Haven Retirement Community in Fairbury, Illinois. Fairview Haven is an apostolic Christian community where choice is valued, growth is encouraged, and life abounds. Their team strives by the grace of God to provide the highest quality of life to all those that they serve without regard to race, color, religion, or their ability to pay. Fairview has created a haven that supports the spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional needs of all who call it home. Here they seek to embrace life and honor the dignity of all of their residents and their right to make choices for themselves in a safe and nurturing environment. This unprecedented level of care extends also to their staff, who are loved, cared for, and appreciated beyond measure. If you want to be a light in our world, if you think you have the skills to provide great care for others, and if you want to have an immense and positive impact on the lives of many of our most beloved community members, then consider joining the team at Fairview Haven in Fairbury, Illinois. Loving as Jesus loves, Fairview Haven.
Yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, I think partially hard to say because I haven't studied a lot of other governmental systems and structures and things like that. Certainly ones that have used as a foundation some of the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? But it's interesting, even the sort of original authors of the Constitution and things like that in some ways they weren't Christians the way modern Christians might think about it. They're more deists and things like that, right? So they were very interested in the idea that God had sort of created everything, but then sort of let it off, it's off and running, right? It wasn't that God constantly had it. And that matters a little bit, because if you look at the sort of Hebrew Bible and the stories in Genesis, God's pretty active, right? So by chapter 6, he's not happy with everything, and here comes this big flood, right? And then, Abraham and Sarah meet God and angels, right? God's pretty active in the early part of the Hebrew Bible. So there's a way in which that transcendence, where is God in the world, that changes over time and changes in communities, right? And even the biblical authors recognize that distance. And so Jesus, angels, other intermediary saints in the Catholic tradition matter quite a bit, because the sort of approachableness, the immediateness of God changes over time, at least in human perception. So
the immediateness of God, you mean how directly he's involved?
Yeah, within human, at least the way the texts talk about it, the level to which God is active in human history in a way that humans immediately recognize. So if you take the Genesis story and the flood versus the way in which you might see where is in the New Testament, it's very much Jesus as opposed to God, right? There's moments, right? Transfiguration or something like that. But it changes, I think, over time. And then you have in sort of this growth of speculation about angels and things like that matters quite a bit, because and then this too is also in the Second Temple period, then feeds into the sort of growth of apocalyptic literature, which apocalyptic isn't necessarily like things blowing up in the end of the world. Apocalypse is a revelation, is what it means. And there's a lot of texts that try to reveal what's going on in heaven, because I think there was a real hunger by these communities to understand what was God's will, how is God going to function in the world. We're looking back to those texts and expecting God to help us, right, to be more active in the world. And I think a lot of, especially Jewish communities, at the destruction of the first temple and the second temple and so on, were wondering, where's God in all of this? Kind of like humans in a modern context might ask, if there's a real atrocity, a terrible event, where is God in this, right? And then that's when you have priests and rabbis and others step into the void and say, you can see God in this, but it's not in the same way that God functioned in the Hebrew Bible.
Well, that's very interesting. We could go so many different directions. Yeah. I do eventually want to ask about the origins of religion as a whole, how far back Judaism goes. You touched on the flood. I might ask about that. But I also want to ask now about, the number one reason people refuse to be religious, especially Christian, in modern day America, for instance, is because they look at the atrocities going on, the tragedy, losing of innocent kids losing their lives, who knows what, just everything in their immediate life that goes wrong. I think it's worth noting, though, in my opinion, that you can't connect the dots looking forward. You don't know how this terrible thing seems just like a terrible thing now, but if you look back more often than not, I think you can see how when you responded in the right way to tragic events, it did lead you somewhere good. And it's not like God. I don't believe that God makes every single thing in your life happen. I think that would be a manifestation of his perfect will, and he gave us free will. I'll ask you about free will, but he doesn't make each and everything happen. We choose, and if we choose for certain things to happen, if we choose how to respond to certain things, to each and everything in the right way, according to the principles that Christ and God laid out for us, we're going to find ourselves at a pretty admirable place, or a good place in our lives more often than not. Not saying we won't experience difficulties, but I just think it's kind of premature for people to turn away from God and religious beliefs when things are just going bad in the moment.
It's also pretty natural. I think you're right, but it's also a pretty natural reaction that
extremely.
See people do in the Bible.
Right. Right. Oh yeah, all day.
So I mean, and even you could even in the Gospels, even Jesus is in the garden isn't certain about the path, right? You see some moments of Jesus's humanity come through even in the Gospels. So it's a pretty human reaction. I think you're right in the long game, but in the it's a pretty natural human reaction to wonder, to blame, right? In when there's real tragedy and so on, and that's where what you're talking about is how does all of it play out across the life of the community, the life of the individual, and so on, versus in the moment. I think it's unfortunate, but it's also a pretty natural reaction for people to be upset in the grief and say, how can God let this happen? The question of theodicy, right, is where is divine justice in this? Why is there evil in the world, right? That people have been wrestling with that, all throughout history, right? You see, that's a very important theme, even in the Hebrew Bible, through the New Testament, and all the way to the modern era. So it's an ongoing challenge of, I would argue, probably, and I think most scholars would say, of monotheists, right? So in a polytheistic system of the Romans, right? Well, so the god of war defeats this other god, your god of war, and all is right in the world, right? One God is more powerful than the other God, and in a polytheistic system, that's not so difficult for them to understand. We're more powerful people. Our God is more powerful. Our God defeated your God, and we win this war. If you get to a monotheistic system, however, right, there's only kind of one being to blame, if you will, right? And so then it becomes a more theologically complicated question. And I mean, I'm way oversimplifying, but you see the premise, right? Is where people would be thinking that the variety, every community, and so the Egyptians, the Romans, whoever, have gods, and those gods are, they're out there and they're powerful, but one might defeat the other. They're not all powerful. They don't run everything. Those can be in competition. But when you get to the place in a community where, or in a culture where there is one God, then good and bad sort of ends in one place. And so then that's where that blame and the question of divine justice comes in. Like, how can the one God that we believe in and worship and takes us as his or her people, right? How can it be that being allows this?
Right.
So. And
yes, of course, this is great things to ponder, and it's only natural to ponder these things. The word Israel means quite literally to wrestle with God, and I think that's what life really is. It's a wrestling match with God. Good prayer is often wrestling with God. And I heard Father Mike Schmitz one time say something along the lines of, yes, bad things happen all the time, man. People with lukewarm and shallow faiths and a lack of a depth of understanding of what they believe can often find themselves in a real predicament. And, what do I believe? How is God even there? Sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes it's because you are dumb. Everything happens for a reason. That's what he says. Everything happens for a reason. Sometimes that reason is that you are dumb and you made a dumb decision. It's not always God making a bad thing happen to you, because people say, like, if I get up and punch my roommate in the face, that's not God making that happen. That's my own free will. According to the nature of God, God's not going to make me sin, because it just doesn't make sense. Maybe he does that in the Bible. Maybe you could prove me wrong there, but it makes no sense for God to cause a man to sin and therefore to create the outcome that generates. It doesn't add up. You need free will. If you're going to have faith, not everything happens because God makes it happen.
Yeah,
do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think you've kind of hit on something really important to kind of circle it back a little to the earlier part of the conversation. Is that's what Genesis chapter 2 and 3 are trying to do. They're trying to explain how is it that human beings, if created in the divine image, fail. Because you get Cain and Abel story. There's a murder, a few chapters
right off the get-go, yeah.
So humans want an answer to that, right? They're wrestling with this idea that there is a divine being, they're created in that divine being's image, and why are things so difficult for humans? Why are they oddly frail? Why are they buffeted by nature? Like, these terrible things will happen. You have fires and earthquakes and things, and all kinds of wild animal come and get, right? I mean, you think about living in the ancient world, right? And you look at the biblical narrative and they talk about lions and things. That's because you wander outside the village and like a big bear just tackles you, right? I mean, there's all kinds of, like, the world, the natural world is a very scary place, especially in antiquity. And so there's all kinds of things. So they're trying to figure out, well, how is it that humans made in the divine image not only are sort of appear to be at the whims of an earthquake or whatever, but also do terrible things to each other. And that comes back to your point, is like the choice, right, in the garden, right? The idea of choosing, right, is one in which humans then start thinking, well, we have something unique from the rest of the created kingdom. Right, in the world, like when they look out into the world, God says you kind of have dominion over all the rest of this, right? But the question is, well, what are the contours of that for humans, and how do humans interact with one another? And see the story as it unfolds, like, well, they're not doing a very good job of handling this themselves. So here comes the 10 Commandments, right? So it's kind of this ongoing story of how should humans sort of live their lives, recognize their gift, interface with God, interface with one another, maintain civil society. Like, it's, you sort of see it kind of unfolding, and they're wrestling with these fundamental questions like in the first few chapters.
We are brought to you by Kelly Gerber, a trusted real estate agent in Central Illinois. Do you need a trusted real estate professional to assist you in navigating through the buying or selling process? If you do, remember one name, Kelly Gerber. Kelly is a phenomenal real estate agent for Keeley Real Estate in Fairbury, Illinois. If you're selling, she has premier marketing strategies implemented to assure that your home is circulated to buyers throughout Illinois. And if you're buying, she has professional relationships with lenders, title companies, inspectors, and attorneys to alleviate the stress that comes with buying a home. Whether buying or selling, Kelly works hard to ensure that the real estate process is enjoyable and stress-free. It's a seller's market, so the time to call is now. Call Kelly up at 217-390-8205 or send her an email at kelly@keeleyrealestate.com to begin your real estate journey today. Member of Mid-Illinois Realtors Association, Illinois Board of Realtors, and the National Association of Realtors. We are brought to you by Forest Edge Tree Service, who's been supporting this show for a long time and supporting the Livingston County area for even longer. If you guys have trees or tree stumps on your property that you want gone, go nowhere else but Livingston County's premier tree service provider, Forest Edge Tree Service. Your yard is no place for looming, dead, or damaged trees because it's just a matter of time before they come down, ruining your property, ruining your week, and ruining your bank account. This is exactly why you need to be a responsible adult and hire the services of Forest Edge Tree Service. Simply give Joe Rudin a call or a text at 815-615-3037 to get a free quote today. Keep your family, pets, vehicles, and neighbors safe, and save yourself from a world of headaches when you call or text Forest Edge Tree Service to get those dangerous, looming, troublesome trees off of your property. That's Forest Edge Tree Service, Livingston County's premier tree service provider.
Right.
Wow. Extremely interesting.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good segue to go back to where we kind of started this at. Thank you for going on that tangent and going off the rails.
It was nice to be able to bring it back a little bit too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with, in the beginning, when did religion begin? What were some of the earliest religions that you know of? Because I've always been confused if Adam and Eve truly began, if you looked at it from a fundamental standpoint, taking the Old Testament literally, Adam and Eve would effectively be Jews, at least the roots of Judaism and Christianity. Then, where do religions get their start? If I'm putting this question even remotely
No, it's perfectly fine to ask. I'll admit, even with all my training in that's not necessarily an area of specialty, because that question could and probably necessarily supersedes even Judaism and Christianity. So you look at ancient humans, prehistorical humans burying one another with items and things, right?
Whoa,
so,
really? How long ago do you think?
Tens of thousands of years. So prehistorical. So before any of the written record of the community. So there's a written record of any kind of community. So even ancient Egypt would predate Judaism in having religious beliefs, right? So, there's other cultures out there too. Now, many of those would be what I think from a modern perspective, we would consider either polytheistic, many gods, or henotheistic, which is maybe there's a top god and then lots of other gods. Even ancient Greece, right? Or something like that. So almost all the ancient cultures have either a god or a pantheon of gods. So in the historical record, I would venture, but again, not an expert, to say that you could pretty much find religious beliefs very early in the written human record, right? Because I think that those helped to shape, and others would argue they help shape power structures, right? And I think there's merit to that. The argument that those in charge used religion, right, as a tool in order to kind of maintain their leadership, their control, their power in those communities. And that's for a different argument. But if that's true, then that's also part and parcel of sort of the earliest written records about communities are going to involve maintaining those early traditions. So if the religious beliefs are central to maintaining identity, then those are some of the most important things you're going to write down. Mm-hmm. So that I think if you go in historical records in most communities, you'll probably find what we would call religion, broadly speaking, in most communities right back to near their origins. But the question of moving beyond that to the prehistorical record and which community does it start with, and that's kind of outside my expertise. But I think it's an extraordinarily interesting question, but I don't know that I'm kind of already out of my depth a little. But I think with these ancient communities, we can definitely say there's ancient communities of the Mediterranean and certainly in India and other cultures where that probably even would predate Judaism and Christianity, right? Or the Judeo-Christian, what we know as the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Well, what can you tell me? First of all, I think it's so fascinating that humans have probably long been religious, looked up to the sky, thought someone else metaphysical without knowing what metaphysical even meant, has been, at least in part, running the show. Something higher than them, a higher power. I think that's extraordinary. That's in our DNA, quite literally, perhaps. I wonder how long ago that began, and perhaps I personally think that evolution's a thing, right? You know, that science has not proven, but it's a strong theory that evolution is to blame for, well, the evolution of humanity, of humankind, of animals, blah, blah, blah. I think that there was a point where whatever came before Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, I don't know, at some point when we had the conscious mind with the moral compass that we have now, that I believe that maybe that was Adam and Eve, that before Adam and Eve, perhaps there were these beasts that were humanoid, and that when we became what we are today with the moral compass, perhaps God did speak to these people. He gave them a soul, and it's not unreasonable to think that the conscience that we have today, I think Pope John Paul II wrote about it, maybe Pope Benedict, that each human has a soul, and we do have a moral conscience. The moral conscience is really directly connected to the soul or something like that. Therefore, if you're a jungle person, you do not know anything about Scripture, that abiding by your moral compass would be healthy for your soul, and therefore heaven would be, accessible to you in that way if you abide by the moral conscience guided by the Holy Spirit, blah, blah, blah. I'm making a mess of this whole thing, but see, what was I going to say here? What can you tell me just about where do you think Judaism got its start? How does Judaism even start? Is that even known to you?
Well, again, that's another tricky one because you start to go backwards far enough where you're counting on the written record, right? So you have archaeology as well, but then you're interpreting the archaeological record as well. But so you look at the Hebrew Bible and the written record, and it purports to go back to the beginning. The challenge, of course, is if it's truly the beginning, no one was there to record it. So that you have the problem of it. We know it's a tradition that's being carried through. Then you move into the period of pretty quickly after Genesis, which is creation to moving into the historical era. Then you get to Moses, and a lot of scholars have tried to figure out, where in time is the Moses narrative approximately, aligning with Egypt and things like that. So if we called that 1350 BCE or something like that, so then you move within one book from beginning to, through the historical record right up until demonstrable points in other cultures' history. So now you're overlapping the Egyptian history. I think you could say in there somewhere is the start of an identity of a culture, of a people, and a set of beliefs then that would ultimately lead to what we know to be later to be broadly speaking, Judaism. So then in that next 1,000 years, you have the development of what we know as the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, leading up to then the time of Jesus, right? And in that time before Jesus is not just, there's no uniform Judaism, right? There's Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes who write the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then there's Christians who are probably another subset, if you will, of Judaism. So it's never a monolith, but I think you have the traditions that we would call the Old Testament are in that 1,000-year period before Jesus. And I think that's reasonably certain in some sense because you have the first temple and then you have the second temple. So you can bear out that those communities existed there with archaeology as well as corroborating a lot of the textual points in terms of historical record, because they overlap with the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, right? There's a lot of overlap with other communities and cultures that we also have written record. Right. And then the archaeological record. So in that period, there's little doubt, I think, that a community exists. Do all of the people exist exactly the way they say in the Bible? Is it all exactly historical? Probably not. Right. Just like it's difficult, the further back that you go in time, the more difficult it is to have precision about when the people lived, what they did, because all you have is the written record. Mm-hmm. And over time, that written record, necessarily, in some sense, if you think about human community, sort of gets embellished and, because people take on these larger and larger kind of, roles in the community itself. Like, right, Moses isn't just Moses. He's not just a person. By the time you get to Jesus's time, right, it's the 5 books of Moses. Moses received all of the law when he was up on Sinai. And then, you have the transfiguration story. And where's Moses?
Well, Moses in Transfiguration, he's like in the sky, doesn't
he?
he?
Yeah, he's hanging out with God.
Is it him and Elijah or something?
Yeah, Moses never really dies a human death, and then he's absorbed up into the heavens. And then the Transfiguration story, here's this brilliant figure that is Moses. Like, that's kind of a big deal. So like clearly if even if Moses, as we think about him as a human person in 1350 BCE, by the time of Jesus, he's kind of bigger than whoever the human person Moses was, right? He's taken on this much more important role in that community. And that doesn't necessarily for me mean, well, let's get rid of Exodus because this can't be true.
Right.
It just means you have to take it and understand it for what it is as a cultural historical project, right? Or a product, and that it's very important in that community, but it's interpreted in that community, right? In a different community, Moses isn't important. And that's okay, right? And that you would expect that Moses as a kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of a hero in Judaism is going to have his characteristics and things grow over time, just like what happens, I think, in some regards to what happens to Jesus, right? They sort of early Christians go through what, we talk about Christology. They try to figure out who Jesus is. They pretty quickly, he's not just a human, he's not an angel, right? They've kind of moved through this checklist of things they have in their tradition trying to figure out who he is. And they move pretty quickly to, wow, he was pretty important, and it's not as simple as any one category we can put Jesus in. And I think that similar things had gone on with Moses and other key figures, and I'm okay with that. That's kind of what cultures and traditions do, right? With key figures, right? It's part of the identity of the community and the culture and the importance of the person. But we just have to recognize that a little bit in the text and not either be so absolutist to say, well, no, that's exactly how it happened. Recognize there's human agency in there, nor is it, well, because it's written like that, there can't be anything valuable and we just chuck it out, right? I think you got to live with that ambiguity a little bit in the text, and then it can still be valuable. So
We are brought to you by Fairbury Indoor Flea, a monthly indoor flea market hosted by Trish's Treasures in Fairbury, Illinois. This flea market is held every second Saturday of every month from October to May from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So that's Saturday, October 9th, November 13th, December 11th, and so forth. There will be a wide variety of items available at these events, such as plenty of man cave pieces, vintage and antique collectibles, tools, dishes, jewelry, furniture, cupcakes, and cookies even, crafts, steamer trunks, customized cups, shirts, pens, signs, and so much more. Additionally, at each market there will be 7 local vendors. The second Saturday of each month just got a whole lot sweeter. Again, this will be all at Trish's Treasures in Fairbury, Illinois, which is an awesome vintage store. For one-of-a-kind antiques, art collectibles, furniture, and gifts, and also for any and all of your refurbishing and repurposing needs, check out Trish's Treasures in Fairbury, Illinois, located in the old bowling alley on the west end of town, right off of Route 24. Great place, great flea market. Check them all out. I wish you would have seen before I put this wall up. Behind you in my kitchen is a big poster of a Bible chronology chart in conjunction or whatever with real world events, like what was going on in Egypt when Moses was doing. I'm actually fascinated by that period of time because when Moses is doing this stuff, according to this chart, there's a lot of other important worldly events going on as well. Yeah. And so it's just cool to see like what was going on in the world at this time.
Sure. Oh yeah, no, that's looking at that can be pretty important in some regards because there's a lot of cross-cultural sharing of ideas too, right? So I mean, let's move a little bit forward, but to the era of Alexander the Great. Mm-hmm. So you get into the late 300s BC. Alexander conquers much of the known world, right? You'd imagine that 300 years before Jesus doesn't have a lot of impact on Jesus, but the New Testament's written in Greek because of Alexander, right? Because of his conquest. Like his conquest changed the face of what we would call, from our perspective, the ancient Near East, which includes Israel and so on. And so the first Christians writing in Koine Greek, because Alexander made Greek the language, the common language of much of the ancient Near East.
How did I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah.
So where did Alexander the Great come from? You're going to laugh at my historical
No, that's all right.
knowledge.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is important stuff that I do in a lot of my intro to Bible, and even in, Jesus in the Gospels course and that too. So Alexander is son of Philip of Macedon, and so Macedonia, northern Greece. So not kind of the fingery part, but the kind of northern part of Greece. And he winds up sort of inheriting Philip's kingdom in Greece, and Greece and Persia. The movie The 300. You may have heard of that. That's about the Greek and Persian wars, right? So the Persian Empire at this point is in the ancient Near East, is ascended. It's a very powerful kingdom. It has conquered Israel, right? The first temple has fallen, and so on, and it's moved through what we would call modern day Turkey. And so across the Hellespont there, we have Greece. And Alexander says, no, we're not going to settle for that. We're going to push back against the Persians. Well, Alexander, everybody knows by name, right? He winds up pushing them back across what we would know as modern day Turkey, down through Israel, modern day Israel and Palestine, into Egypt, right? So that when you get to Egypt, the city of Alexandria, right, which we know is named after Alexander the Great, right? And there are many Alexandrias, but that's one of the most.
We all knew that.
Yeah. So then Alexander keeps his army is incredible, and they keep, now bearing in mind that this is 300 something BCE, so they're doing this all on horseback and on foot. They go as far as the Indus River, so they're at the edge of India. So that includes to this, so you've heard about some of the destruction of monuments in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq. In some cases go back to Alexander, because he conquered all, like if you look at a map, he conquered all that, and his army sort of said, we're going to stop here. Like they kind of gave up on. He could have probably gone into India. If you think about how extraordinary that is, an accomplishment in that time. Not that it's necessarily good to be a conqueror, but extraordinary logistical and other accomplishment. And so then Alexander dies very young. He's 33. And so then his kingdom is sort of broken up amongst his generals, right? But what is left is this sort of massive change of that part of the world to the Greek language becoming the common language, because his generals and his armies settle all across this and form new cities and things like that. And so that becomes really what, from a modern historical, scholars will call it the Greek East, right? And so the Greek sort of empire continues. And so even all the way into the time of Jesus, that whole part of the Mediterranean and well into the ancient Near East, or the going towards India, is all sort of Greek based. And then later on, with the sort of the rise of Caesar, right, Europe and the West is Latin based. Right. But there's really it's kind of schism which affects Christianity, right? Because there's a language schism, if you will, in the Greek East and the Latin West. Right. But that all starts with Alexander, sort of, and his conquest. And so the Christians that arise in this area, right, they're common, Koine is common Greek, right? So it isn't Socrates Greek, right? It's a little bit more simplified form of Koine. And this is the language that many of them know. And the gospel writers will write in Greek for that reason. So it's that far back, but then that cross-cultural exchange matters, because then early Christian ideas are in a sense formulated and communicated in Greek, even though these are probably primarily Jewish, what we would consider Jewish thinkers.
So they weren't speaking, according to what you're saying, were the apostles in Christ, were they at least bilingual and probably trilingual? Because I thought Jesus spoke Aramaic, everyone spoke Greek, or they were killed probably because they enforced that. And then Latin also was kind of the language of what, law and commerce or something like that? Were they trilingual people?
Well, that's a good question, and I'd caution that I don't know for certain, but I would say that we would surmise that locals in those areas would speak Aramaic, right? So Jesus is primarily an Aramaic speaker. However, my hunch is that Jesus and others, as city dwellers to a certain extent, Jerusalem, maybe Tyre and Sidon and so on. Some of these are pretty Romanized cities, as we've learned from archaeology, probably knew some Greek. Jesus probably did. Whether his apostles did isn't clear. Paul is almost certainly intellectual and bilingual. Probably closer to trilingual, because he says he's trained as a Pharisee, and we have no reason to doubt that. So that means he trained in Judaism, and he trained in Hebrew language. But he writes his letters in Greek, and there isn't much doubt that happened. He probably knows some Latin, but interestingly, in Paul's own letters, towards the end of what we think is towards the end of his career, Paul talks about, and this is, I love having students look for this, but Paul talks about in Romans that he intends to go to Spain. Right. So Paul has been active in what we know as the Greek East, because he's literate in Greek and Hebrew. And so he's great because he can take Hebrew ideas and put them in Greek and communicate them to these communities, but has the, if you will, the gravitas of having the Jewish background and knowing the Hebrew Bible and all that. One of the things that Paul, I think, would have felt hindered by when he wanted, because he hoped to continue, and then I think that's where his career ends when he winds up being arrested and goes to Rome. But when he writes to the Romans and says, "I'm coming, I hope to gain your support and go on to Spain." So he intends to continue his missionary work in the Latin West. But I think by support, he means not only financial support, but I need some translators. Like, I need some people that know the lay of the land. I need people that know Latin. And so on. So he's looking to gain that support. So that gives you an idea of, hundreds of years later in Christianity, why do we have this sort of schism, and why are the church councils fighting over words? That's because the bishops of the Latin West are in Latin and the bishops of the East are in Greek, and they don't always agree, right? Because when you take important words like consubstantial and put them into Greek or Latin.
Right. What's that called? That was actually a big issue, right?
Yeah.
The name.
You have in the Council of Nicaea, you have this great debate about that. And then so over the centuries, you wind up with the Church of the East and the Church of see where the seeds of that are planted effectively with Alexander hundreds of years before Christianity exists, right? And so that continues, and even down into Egypt, if you think like names we know, like Cleopatra, right? She is a descendant of Greek and Egyptian culture, right? So even though that's Egypt, by the time, because we think of Egypt, of pyramids and all of that stuff, but by the time you get to Cleopatra, she's actually sort of generationally intermarried into the Greek kings as well as being a queen of Egypt. So a lot has changed in that part of the world because of Alexander's influence.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Very interesting. And yes, I have friends that are Greek Orthodox. I guess he's always just said Orthodox, but I believe that's Greek Orthodox. And our doctrines, for the most part, are
pretty close. Yeah, they're pretty close. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just they're a little more traditional. They have much more emphasis on older style art. Really, they're more pious people than Catholics on average, I think. They take it a little more seriously. They're a little more traditional.
Yeah, there's more tradition. There's more the art is different. It's more Byzantine-based art. So the art's going to look different than the art of the Latin West from the Middle Ages. Yeah. I agree with that. So the art's different. Some tenets are different. But yeah, a lot of it is at the core very, very similar, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of talk. I think there's probably a lot of Catholics that are converting to Orthodoxy.
I could see that. Yeah.
Because we're getting a lot of pretty worldly in Catholicism, I guess. And there's a lot of bad press about the Catholic faith. And whereas the Orthodox faith is very unwavering, still at the end of the day, the doctrine, in my humble opinion, is not fully correct in Orthodoxy. So I'm going to stay here, and it doesn't matter.
And there's a lot of variety within Orthodoxy in the modern world, right? You can have, in almost all countries, you can have Greek, but you can have Syrian, Russian, they're Ukrainian, like there's different churches in Orthodoxy. But yeah, far enough back is both the language split and then obviously the split of the Roman Empire at the end of the sort of the fall of the sort of known Roman Empire. But then you get the new capital in Constantinople, right? And you get the Byzantine Empire that arises. So you sort of have this like weird continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, right? But the sort of Roman Empire of the West falling in the early 400s, but that doesn't mean it's gone. And then you have the sort of revivification of that by Charlemagne, right? So like these things kind of, they sort of still resonate, right, in long after. And so but that's how far back. And so that was all to your point about the different cultures. And what I was trying to get at there is just the way in which the different cross-cultural, integration of ideas matters a great deal. Because so another sort of thinking in Egypt, you get to the Christianity comes in the 1st century. Well, even to this day, there are still Coptic Christians.
What does that mean exactly?
Those are Egyptian Christians, right? But they have a different language, Coptic. And they had, and we, in some cases, we even, so think about Gospel of Thomas.
Oh, which is a lost gospel, or what's that called? Pseudepigraphal?
Yeah, pseudepigraphal or non-canonical gospel.
Right.
The copies we have are in Coptic because these books are circulating in Egypt.
Really?
And so, and many probably date to the 1st and 2nd century. So not long after, same time period as the canonical gospels and just after. So there's like this whole community, but that's an interesting overlap of, Egyptian, Greek culture, and then the sort of origin of Christianity in a new environment, right? So all the Gnosticism and all of these books that scholars have kind of pooled together and called Gnostic, a lot of that is happening in Egypt and in what would be the East versus the West is sort of moving towards what we would think of as the, more of a Catholic orthodoxy, but it takes, as you point out, it takes hundreds of years until they have the councils and kind of decide this is what we Christians think, and we don't think those things. It takes a long time for them, much longer than I think most Christians realize, for them to figure these things out. And then it's not exactly harmonious when they agree.
Right. Real quick, what does Gnostic mean?
Yeah, so Gnostic, gnosis in Greek, is knowledge. Oh. And so the Gnostic scholars have used this, and there's a lot of criticism of whether it's a good category, but in general, it refers to a rather large body of texts, non-canonical, so they're not in the Bible, but from the Christian era, in which they sort of capture Jewish and a lot of also Christian ideas. Jesus features in a lot of those texts as well. But instead of the idea of revelation, like you see it in the book of Revelation or Paul or something, it comes from gnosis, where there's some knowledgeable figure who reveals hidden secrets. So you have the Gospel of Thomas. And so Thomas is like the hero of that text, or the Gospel of Philip. And Philip is the sort of person who reveals knowledge, right? Secret knowledge. And in a lot of cases in these different Gnostic Gospels, it's, the Gospel of Kevin. It's because Jesus pulled Kevin aside, and these are the secret things that Jesus told Kevin, and now Kevin's telling you. And so they're very different than the canonical tradition that says, inspired, or we walked around, we followed Jesus, and these are the things that happen. These are more discursive, and it's often where an individual figure, maybe it was 10, 15 years ago now, the Gospel of Judas was found, right? But then, these are non-canonical, right? The later church tradition said, these don't fit with our beliefs. We don't know that these go back to the apostles. So they made these kinds of judgments about their authority. But this is a whole other sort of aspect of the development of Christianity that's out there. And that's kind of these are the kinds of things I teach about in my classes, so that students can realize, there is this path to Christianity that's come to you in the modern era, but the path is, far wider and much more multifaceted than. But
then you look back at these early times prior to the 4th century or so, where they were differentiating, they were coming up with the canon of the Bible. What books were to be put in this very important collection of books that would serve as a guiding light for the rest of humanity, for the rest of time. And I really seem to trust them in their declining of the Gospel of Thomas, the declining of the Gospel of Philip, because they thought that, one, these were fraudulent. They maybe weren't authored by who they were supposedly authored by. But also, do you trust them? Or do you think that truly Philip and truly Thomas, or at least someone who worked for them, really wrote those things? Or do you think we were right in not including them in the Bible? And if you could also say, why didn't we include them in a Bible just to put it out there?
Well, authorship is one of the reasons, for sure, that they wondered about. So who wrote this is always a question about authority, right? Is this an authoritative text? However, what I will say is there's pretty strong arguments within, scholarship that says that some of the Pauline letters, say Titus, Timothy, for example, or something, were not penned by Paul himself, but that were written by maybe people in Paul's inner circle and things like that.
Sure, that was always my understanding of it.
Yeah. So the authorship isn't absolute as a reason to say no, right? So it is, just because, maybe it wasn't written by Philip, it doesn't mean it couldn't be a canonical text. But then I think the real litmus test for a text is not necessarily even the authorship, although if you can verify that it's not by so age is a question. When was this written? If it doesn't appear until the first time we hear about it till 300, probably not in. We're fairly certain it wasn't written by any of the known apostles, probably not in. But more than anything is the ideas contained therein, right? And that's where the community shapes things more than anything.
If they coexist with pre-existing ideas and beliefs.
Yeah, you got it, right? Because what's canon? Canon in Greek is a yardstick. Right, that's what it really means. A canon is something you lay down a measuring stick. So think of a yardstick. Well, why do we use a yardstick? Well, because when I take my team to the other stadium and the football field's supposed to be 100 yards long, we got to agree on what a yard is, right? Well, that's all that canon means. It's like these ideas are part of the community of ideas, and those are outside, right, of the community of ideas. So they're canonical or they're non-canonical. So you sort of get a community that agrees this is what we think, and then those ideas are not what we think. So then they're non-canonical. So more than anything, the litmus test is what are the ideas contained therein. But certainly other things like authorship and age and things like that definitely figure in. Like if they know where did this come from, they're probably not going to be particularly interested in trying to include it. But if it had been, then it gets trickier, because like one of the things there, I think, are pretty good scholarly arguments to say that the source material, the earliest part of the Gospel of Thomas, dates back to the year 50 or 60 CE. So a little bit after Jesus died. It may be as old as the Gospel of Mark or a little bit older. So age there is a bit of a question then. Like if age is a qualifier, why isn't Thomas in? But then it changes over time. Ideas are added, right? Does it fit with the growing Orthodox ideas? No. Is it like anything else that we see in the other Gospels? Not really. And so there's pretty good reasons why you can say, well, these are ultimately the reasons they didn't include it, because it doesn't look like the other texts. It doesn't. Maybe they didn't know whether it went back to Thomas. Maybe Thomas isn't the person we want to highlight as a good apostle. But those are all communal decisions based on beliefs, right? And so that's how they came to those conclusions. And even when you get to, Nicaea and some of the later councils, when they're deciding what books are in, it's the same kind of thing, because there are books that are on the bubble. Should we include Revelation? Like some people are like, I don't know. It's got some pretty crazy ideas, right? And so Revelation isn't for certain with everybody in every vote for becoming canonical. So, they're trying to wrestle with these things, and so it's not always a given. I think with a lot of Paul's letters, once Paul died, we as the community know Paul wrote these, and now Paul's gone, and anything that sort of just arises and looks like Paul later, we're like, does that fit with what Paul would have said? Maybe we'll put it in. Do you think
people were what incentive would people have to fake these things, to fake these writings? Well, because undoubtedly that happened at least on occasion.
Sure.
Right?
I think, two things I'll say to that. One, they probably faked them with the idea that everybody would know it was fake, in the sense that if let's say Paul's friend is Larry, and everybody knows Larry was Paul's right-hand man, and then Paul died, but hey, Larry wrote this letter or finished a letter Paul had started. Well, if the community at the time knew that Paul started it and Larry was Paul's trusted associate, the community's like, we're good with it. But then later scholars come to it and say, well, how did this get here? It doesn't sound like Paul. It doesn't look like Paul. It doesn't smell like Paul, whatever. And so the community at the time, so it could have been a thing where it was an open secret. Like it wasn't because, and the tie to that then is the idea in antiquity that, famous writers, so a Socrates or a Tacitus or somebody like that, Roman and Greek authors, had people that copied them. And wrote in their style, and that wasn't necessarily as bad. It wasn't sort of, there weren't the copyright laws and things like that of the modern era. There wasn't, you weren't being a plagiarist. You were actually honoring the person a bit to write in their style and everything too. So the social structure around, I'm going to write in Paul's style, particularly if you were one of Paul's confidants, nobody would have thought, I think you're a terrible person for doing that. They would have thought you're trying to continue Paul's traditions.
And
right?
you're of the same school of thought, therefore it's okay for you to do this.
Yeah, I really do think that was not, it shouldn't have been rampant, and it would have only been a select set of people. But I think that it's not inconceivable that they wanted to keep those traditions going, and they would have looked to the people that were immediately in his circle to do something like that, whether that's Timothy or Titus or whatever. And that's often why they have those names, and whether they're because they're written to those people or were attributed to people and whatever. And I think that's what happens in these non-canonical gospels. Attributing them gives them that kind of ring of authenticity, where in some cases, the people who wrote them might have believed this knowledge came from Thomas, Philip, or whoever. But later communities came to say, no, I don't recognize an apostle that I know in this, and so it's not part of the tradition. So we just don't know enough exactly about how the communities came to write these texts, but we know there was a variety in the way that they were receiving the tradition and the way they were interfacing with other cultures and all of these things.
So that's an interesting topic in itself, is the authenticity of the authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First of all, people don't realize that, who was it? So it's Mark and Luke were not actually eyewitnesses of Christ, but most likely what happened is Luke could have wrote. Do you think that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were truly the authors of the Gospels?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean,
it is tricky.
I think that it's difficult to say for certain. I think it's possible that we have within those eyewitness traditions are the people that we think of as the evangelists, right? The four names. Did they walk around and follow Jesus and write down everything he said? I see it as unlikely, but not impossible. Partially just because of the way that scholars think about the dates for the texts, so that it would be difficult, like they'd be fairly old by the time they wrote them, but again, not impossible. But it's more for me of a question of, is that what people were doing? So let's think about Jesus, like the way we know Jesus through the narrative. Jesus is walking around and his primary function is to teach orally, right? If Jesus was a writer, we'd have all of his texts, and that would be great. But we don't. Jesus walked around to communities, healed, and taught. Right.
But he did have literate people following him.
No doubt.
Yeah.
But his primary function was that. And so I think as he walked around and did those things, nobody was too worried, because let's think also about Jesus's career, relatively short. His public career was relatively short. It ends really abruptly. So I don't think until the community loses Jesus, they were particularly worried. They're like, this is a young guy. He's amazing. He's running around doing all. They're not particularly worried about writing everything down. They're more worried about what he's doing. Then you lose Jesus in this terrible event. And then I think you start, what did Jesus say? What did he do? And then I think you get this pretty quickly after, people trying to write down and remember, because I don't think there's immediately any need to report, right? To write down and report. Like Jesus is gaining his following in the way that, that is working for him, which is to just walk around and gain followers, and go to cities, perform miracles, teach to people, and so on, challenge the authorities in some instances, right? And gain followers that way. And so I don't know that they're immediately worried about like sort of writing a transcript of where he goes down. But I think that within that are all kinds of true stories that people remember about Jesus. But I think then the gospel writers try to give them a narrative framework that is something of their own invention. Not saying it's fiction, but they kind of create, he went here, then he went here, and in this city this happened, this maybe it didn't. I don't care if something happened in Tyre or in Sidon or in even if it was a story in Jerusalem or not in Jerusalem, like because in case of, like, for example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus goes from the north in the Galilee to Jerusalem 3 times, for seasonal festivals, right, in Judaism. But in Mark, he just sort of does one big loop and winds up in Jerusalem and never. I'm okay with that. Like, I'm okay with that sort of ambiguity in what Jesus' schedule was, because I don't think Jesus was too worried about that. Jesus was worried about the lessons he was teaching, the miracles, and so on. So I'm not discomfited by the idea that Jesus is that this story happened in this village at this time and this point in his career. I think the evangelists try to help us understand the meaning of those by putting them in certain contexts.
And this kind of goes with the theme of this was written by the hands of man to get the important stuff onto paper that would serve for generations to come. So
Yeah.
it is entirely possible that one of these, in antiquity, one of these ancient people may have gotten a detail wrong, or maybe it was lost in translation.
Probably did. Yeah, probably did. And that's, again, I don't think that takes away from the importance of it, the authority of it, but human error is there. Like, we can both see it in the written tradition when we look at all the different manuscripts, but also just sometimes geographically what they have Jesus do when he's walking around various cities around the Galilee. He goes here, then he goes here, then he goes here. Like, he would have just walked here to, so I mean, some of it just gives you this hints that maybe the authors either didn't care about those details, and not because they didn't matter, but they didn't matter, right? Jesus matters. What Jesus taught mattered. What Jesus did mattered. But like, if they meant for it to be this kind of transcript of what Jesus did, I think we would have had a transcript of what Jesus did. But what was more important is who he was, what he said, what his actions were, where they happened, right? And then all of that, what did it mean? Right? Because that's really what the Gospels really get at, is giving you 4 really different and important answers to what did it mean.
Right.
Who was this person, and what did all that he did mean for us now? That's what that's what the heart of the Gospels is, I think. And they give you 4 windows into that are different and the same at the same time. They're the same person with a lot of the same kinds of core ideas, but then very different, maybe stylized to the communities that needed to hear those stories, maybe because they had different information. They had different eyewitnesses that brought different pieces. Maybe John had different things, and it seems that he probably did, from Mark. And so that those Gospels don't necessarily, you can't just one for one those together. And that doesn't, as a historian, doesn't surprise or bother me, or say, well, I have to throw all this out now. You just have to contextualize it and say, okay, there's limits to what we're going to be able to know, and it probably didn't happen exactly like this. And that's that erosion of like, what's the word of God? It happened exactly this way. There's just times in the Bible where you can't reconcile it, and it's difficult to say if that was the case, God would just come on, I need to edit this, and if it really was that, versus equally people using any kind of discrepancy to just, I'm done with this as a cultural text. Like, of course not, because you wouldn't do that with any ancient document or any ancient evidence. It's just the struggle of folks keeping any kind of historical perspective on the data that they're getting, and then bringing to bear, non-canonical texts, Greco-Roman history, archaeology. It's like all these things you can do, but it hasn't always been a very reasoned exercise of the way that you bring in other history or especially non-canonical texts. How much can they tell us about the world of Jesus? That hasn't always been done in a way that would show a lot of objectivity, right? Or show fairness to that there were other communities and differing points of views. Yeah. So if you're open to that, and to archaeology and other things, you can learn a great deal about insights into that world. We can't know exactly, right? It's 2,000 plus years ago, so we can't know exactly what happened, but we can make pretty smart, pretty educated guesses about what that world was like, what Jesus was trying to accomplish, what his beliefs were coming out of the Jewish tradition, and then how the early Christians tried to understand. And that's what Paul's doing too, right? They're trying to understand who Jesus was, how God was acting in history through him, and why he's important. That's what all the New Testament is about, whether it's the Gospels or Paul's letters. And even Revelation is doing that to an extent, right? It's just pushes it forward, right? But it's still unfolding for Christians.
Would you agree, though, that the Gospels are exceptionally well written given the time and given the people who apparently authored them? Like, I've heard that Luke's accounts are, like, he was a historian extraordinaire. Would you agree with that? That these are exceptionally well written?
Well, I think they fit well with the kinds of ancient documents that we see others writing in that era. In
other historians,
other historians.
I don't even want to take a crack at the names. Like, I don't know when Homer lived or anything.
Yeah, other writers of that era. I think the gospel writers and the other writers in that era, I think they're good writers. They write in Koine, so it's a little bit different kind of style than maybe some of the more famous, Greek and Roman writers would have, sort of written. But I think they have in mind to try to write, each of them does for their own community, try to write the story of who Jesus is for their own community. And my hunch is that they're not overlapping communities, so that, John is somewhere and Mark is somewhere, and maybe most scholars believe that Mark and another document Q are the foundation for Matthew and Luke, but that each of those, sort of, they inherit Mark and they inherit this list of sayings of Jesus, and then they kind of write their own stories. And I'm okay with that. Like, that they have some slightly different ideas about who Jesus was and where he came from, right? If you think about the birth narratives of Luke and of Matthew, there's stuff in common, there's stuff that's different, right? And that's because, again, in the age before the internet, right? These are folks that are handwriting these stories in order to record them, and they aren't really easily communicating with one another, right? So if you have a community that's one's in Egypt, one's in, the Holy Land, one is in what we call modern day Turkey, and one is in modern day Greece, it's not easy at all for those communities to communicate and share ideas, right? So that, big surprise, when they talk about Jesus and they have some shared core ideas, they sort of go off in their own directions too, about the importance of him, how they interpret what the meaning of his death was, all of those things. It shouldn't be too surprising to us that there's not this kind of homogeny of ideas, because they're not able to share they're not, on the internet sharing those ideas. Like, somebody has to write this, and most people in antiquity are non-literate too. Remember that too as well. We're talking about a very small percentage of people who are literate. So it's not like when you sat down with a community, most of them could have been writing. So there's only a small number of writers, and then they have to travel around, and travel isn't particularly safe, right? And Paul tells us about that, his whole litany of, terrible things that happen to him when he's traveling, right? And things like that, and shipwrecks, and those are real, right? Those are real. It's very dangerous to travel. And so Paul is to me, rather extraordinary in the sense of his endurance of like all of this, and to then do this and go community to community and try to spread these ideas. So that's who's doing this. And so, big surprise then that, Paul will get frustrated too. He goes to a city, gets the church going, stays there maybe a year or something, then he leaves, and then he gets a letter and finds out they don't believe the right things anymore. He gets all frustrated, writes them a letter right away. Big surprise, right? That's human nature. Like, Paul tries to found the idea on these, on core ideas, that how he understands Jesus and the importance of what they should do. But then, he can't stay there and just nurture them. He has to count on the people in that community, the leaders in that community, because he's going on to the next one. And so think about the Gospels in that context, when they're shared, right, are also going to be adapted to the needs of those individual communities. And there'll be very different communities, and eventually they're different languages too, right? So
wonderful stuff. And for the sake of time, I do want to keep talking about some other things. I could talk to you about this all day. I really could.
No,
but
I enjoy talking about it. So
yes, unfortunately, I do have listeners that want to.
I know. Yeah, no, there's let's please, we can move on.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask this question. So, given your knowledge of the history of the Gospels and the Bible and everything like that, is it fair to say that you believe first and foremost that Jesus Christ truly lived when we believe he lived? Jesus Christ. Is that correct?
What you mean, historical Jesus, like
that
a person?
He existed, yes.
Yeah. No, I don't. There are people that have doubted that. I don't doubt that. There's been people that have tried to make the argument that the Jesus is just a construction of the early church and things. No, I think Jesus really lived. I think that he was a real person. I think he was sadly killed by the Romans for being a political, and it's terrible to use this word today, but it's the word that most appropriately fits it. It's he was politically insurrectionist, right? Because if you look at what's the charge against Jesus?
What is the charge against Jesus, actually?
The King of the Jews, right? And so in here, what's going on there? Well, this is the Roman Empire, right? By this point, by the time Jesus, so prior to the time of Jesus is the end of the Roman Republic. Right. So then Julius Caesar takes on dictatorial powers, becomes the emperor, right, and establishes the Roman Empire. So this is only he declares himself emperor in 44 BC. So this is only, less than 100 years before Jesus dies, 50 years before he's born. And so the Roman Empire initiates there, and then there's a civil war, and then you have Caesar Augustus, the Battle of Actium in 31, kind of sort of establishes the Roman Empire and Caesar Augustus as the emperor. And that is the same Caesar, right? Augustus, formerly Octavian, Augustus Caesar, who is in charge of the Roman Empire when Jesus is born, right? So the Roman Empire is relatively new. Then what happens? Well, then in the story of Jesus in the Gospels, right, is that the the taxation, right? So Jesus' family has to go and be accounted for taxes. And there is some record that something like that takes place, not necessarily on a global level, but on a local level in Syria. Now, the years don't match up, but there is a story about this sort of, because they're annexing all these things into the empire. They're trying to keep track of taxes and so on. But then what you have is, over that time, this area in the ancient world of, what we know as modern day Israel, Palestine, Syria, and so on, is not too comfortable, because they're monotheists, with Roman rule, Roman imperial rule, right? And so there starts to be a lot of kind of sort of rebellion against Roman rule and so on. And what happens apparently to Jesus in this time then is Jesus gains these followers and popularity and everything else, is a charge is sort of brought against Jesus that he is trying to set himself up as a king as opposed to Caesar. Right. And so Julius Caesar is an emperor alone, right, in ruling over the empire. And so Jesus is then killed for setting himself. Whether he did or not is a different question. But all four gospels are pretty clear that the charge against Jesus is that he's trying to become a king. So he's setting up a different political power to the Roman Empire.
Hold up. What about blasphemy? I actually think the charge was blasphemy.
By the Jews.
By the Jews. Okay,
Yeah.
So that's confusing. The Jews took him to court because they're like, this man's...
That's how that was the pretense for arrest. But then he's brought in front of the Romans, right?
Oh.
And who sentences Jesus to death? Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's Roman political power that cost Jesus his life, right? And crucifixion is a Roman punishment.
Right.
And it's a punishment that's usually held out for, political challenges, right? So think of Spartacus, right? We've got stuff about Spartacus, like this. Spartacus was a real slave. He led a real slave revolt in the century before Jesus on the Italian peninsula.
If we have enough documentation about him to realize that he's truly real and he did all these things,
well, I mean,
you think that Jesus, it'd be a foregone conclusion that
I
Jesus
think so.
existed.
I mean, people could probably challenge whether there was a historical Spartacus, but the story there is that he led a slave revolt, and that the Romans were absolutely brutal in shutting that slave revolt down, because unfortunately slavery was real in the Roman Empire, and the Romans understood that their economy was built on slavery. And so they crucified many hundreds of slaves, thousands possibly, on this road going back to Rome during the Spartacus slave road. So this was psychological warfare. It was a Roman punishment that they had actually taken from the Assyrians and other cultures, and it was meant to terrify. It was terrorism, right? It was meant to terrify and cause the populace to not want to rise up again. And so it's pretty clear that this is what happens to Jesus. And in those who might doubt that, there's actually an inscription at Caesarea Maritima, so a city that's along the edge of the Mediterranean, that actually indicates the arrival of Pontius Pilate at just the time we expect him to be there. So an inscribed stone that the Pontius Pilate arrived to be praetor, governor, right, in Judea. So to me, there aren't really reasons to doubt that Jesus lived, that he died at the hands of the Romans. Now, you start tweaking, did Jesus say these exact words? That gets trickier. But your question was did the historical Jesus live? Yeah, I firmly believe that there's no reason to suppose that he didn't, and that he died then at the hands of the Romans right around the year 27 to 30.
Got it. And while I have you here, and I'm talking to such a knowledgeable person on the matter, I have to ask, because I'm very curious. First of all, the Deuterocanonicals, the Catholic Bible, the Bible that was the only Christian Bible for about 1,200 years after the Council of Rome, when they made the canon and everything, until the Reformation, there were 7 not extra books, these Deuterocanonicals, these books in the Old Testament, Wisdom, Maccabees, Judith, the list goes on. What was the reason that those were taken out in the Protestant Bible after 1516 or so? And did the apostles and Jesus's disciples, did they carry around with them in their pocket Bibles, which they didn't have, they wasn't even called a Bible, and their Torahs? I'm not actually sure, so correct me there, but did they carry around with them these Deuterocanonicals, these books of wisdom, Maccabees, things like that?
Okay. All right. No, good question. So,
because if they carried it around, I would believe that Protestants should today also carry them around. If it was good enough for them, it's probably good enough for us.
Yeah,
Loaded
no,
question.
it's a good question. Yeah, it does. You're right. There's an authority type of question about the antiquity, right? And so the Deuterocanonicals come in again. So go back to Alexander. So in short, I'll try to. The books of the primary books of the Hebrew Bible, like Sans, without the Deuterocanonical books, are their primary language. Their first language they were written in was Hebrew. The Deuterocanonical books, the ones you mentioned, like Maccabees and so on, their first language was written. They were written into Greek, so they're late, right?
They're late.
They're late in the sense of how long they were, like the period that they were written. They were written after Greek became the language in Judaism. So, for example, let's take Chronicles. Chronicles, 1 and 2 Chronicles written in the 500s BCE or something like that. Mm-hmm. Then you move up to Maccabees. The story of the Maccabees is a story of events that took place, and we're fairly certain that they did take place in the 160s on down towards close to the time of Jesus. So by that time, Greek is the primary language in this area. So Maccabees is a history of things that happen in the Jewish world, if you will, but it isn't written until 200 BC or closer to the time of Jesus. So what happens? Well, at first, all those books are just sort of written, and people being Jews of that era are reading them. Now, do they think they're on the same level? Probably not, right? My hunch is that what you've got is two kind of tiers, because none of the people of antiquity were walking around with any texts at all. Readers of the text, and you even see this in the Gospels when Jesus goes into the synagogue and he unrolls the Isaiah scroll and then he reads and then says, "This has been fulfilled before your eyes," right? But he's reading Torah text. So just like if you went and visited a synagogue today, and it might be really illustrative for Christians to do that even today. That's how texts were revered and used in antiquity. And so no one carried the text around, but they did revere them and read them in these kinds of settings. So I don't know that Maccabees ever had a Jewish setting besides the Jews of a late era that said these are important religious texts. But Maccabees and some of these other texts tell very interesting stories, and they probably were more likely written by the Maccabees themselves and people who were in power in that era. Right. So they don't, for the Jewish community, they didn't really rise to the level of becoming canon. And so I'll get there in a sec. Mm-hmm. So they're not really Jewish canon, but they're out there as Jewish text. But here's the rub. They were written in Greek. So the Christians come a century later and they're written in Greek and they're hanging around in their Jewish books. Well, what did the Christians do? They're like, we should probably put everything we have in the Old Testament. Why? Because the Christians are reading everything not in Hebrew, but in Greek. So these books got absorbed into what we call the Old Testament, but they never had a real canonical status in Judaism. They just got absorbed in Christianity.
Wow.
And then many centuries later, what happens is that the Catholic Christians realize, we probably shouldn't have those books in here. So they labeled them Deuterocanonical. And they left them. Yeah, they left them in there. They're like, well, we can't pull them out because Catholics are all about tradition, right? We're all about tradition says they're in there, so we can't pull them out. But we can't give them the same status. Like, so if you make a theological argument with me from Judith, and I make an argument from Genesis, you lose, right? So it has a second. Deutero means secondary canonical status. Mm-hmm. So in the Catholic tradition they remain.
Yeah.
And then you get to the 15th, 16th century, right? You get into the Protestant Reformation, and they know this too. They're looking at why are these in there, and they kick them out. It says this is the Apocryphal.
Luther put them in the appendix, didn't he first? And then later they just quit putting them in there at all because he's like, this is important, but it should go in the back.
Yeah, and then they eventually got put in what now a modern Protestant Bible will have them in the Apocrypha, right? In the hidden book. So they have even in a sense less, theological weight than they would in Catholicism, where they have Deuterocanonical status. But it all goes back. We can blame Alexander for that one too.
Right, because of the language difference or whatever.
Yep, because
that messed everything up.
It did. Well, because the Christians absorbed them because they were floating around in Judaism and appeared to be important. But in traditional Judaism that we know is like rabbinic, the roots of rabbinic Judaism, they weren't reading those texts because they were in Greek, so they weren't in the synagogue. But for the Christians, but some Jews were reading them, and so they got absorbed into what the Christians eventually called an Old Testament. And then many centuries later, upon further review, right, they threw the flag and they're like, let's review these books. And we're like, the Catholics are like, well, we probably shouldn't be giving these the same status, but we can't take them out. And then the Protestants said, well, we should take them out. And so they, like you say, Luther moved them, and then they became the kind of this own freestanding, thing, the Apocrypha.
Well, do you think it's still important as far as developing your beliefs? Do you think it is true? Those books are true. You don't think that the apostles probably quoted from them? Do you? Because I've heard that I haven't looked for myself really hard enough that they quote and they pull information from these books. Did the apostles? They probably were able to speak Greek.
Yeah,
correct?
they would have read them.
They would. So
Yeah.
the apostles would have read what we now call the Apocrypha, the Deuterocanonicals. They would have read Maccabees.
Yeah, but I think if you could interview Jesus and ask him what's more important, Genesis or Maccabees, he would have told you Genesis, right? I mean, I think even Jesus would have made that distinction in the sense of the antiquity and the origin. So going back to this question of canon, because the ancient Hebrew books were seen to be books of Moses. And so they would have recognized that if they weren't written in Hebrew and they weren't ancient, they didn't carry the same weight. Why? Because I don't think a lot of Jews of that era liked the Maccabees very much, right? So the Maccabees were the rulers, but the Maccabees they come into their power in a very strange way, and then they lose their powers when the Romans show up. So there's this whole kind of revolt that takes place, the Maccabean revolt, and there's a question of whether they should be in charge, right? So the Maccabees, and so unpacking another piece here, but so the Maccabees come into power in, let's call it 167, the Maccabean revolt, 163 BCE, so before Jesus. But
You called it BCE instead of BC?
Yeah, so scholars, many years, when I first started school, there was this push to change. So AD and BC and AD are before Christ, and then Anno Domini, right? So in the year of our Lord, right? But then, most biblical scholars, and me included, I studied for a long time with Jewish scholars and at a Jewish institution, right? The Hebrew and Jewish Studies Center. A little bit insulting to make them write AD.
Right.
So what they came up with was the numbers don't change. They mean the same thing, but BCE is before the Common Era, and CE is the Common Era, which means the era before the common time of Christianity and Judaism, and then the era that's common to Christianity. So that's all it means, and it's meant to be more inclusive of Jewish colleagues and things like that. But the numbers don't change. So I kind of go in. I just tell my students, you can use either as long as you're consistent.
Sure.
So, but they're one and the same for the numbers. So, approximately 160 some years before Jesus is born is this major revolt in Judaism. And the result of it is a change in power to this family called the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. And most Jews aren't super happy with that. And so what you see happening post the Maccabean revolt is exactly what we mentioned way earlier, was this kind of breaking up of Judaism into smaller groups that think they're the true Judaism. So the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and then this is the era then where you get the Essenes who write the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? So this whole community that moves off to the edge of the Dead Sea and creates its own separate community and writes its own text because they don't like the Hasmoneans who are in charge, right? So you get this whole, and out of that sort of, kind of growth of diversity is exactly where Christianity arises too, right? So you have, so imagine that kind of world with all this diversity, and then John the Baptist is out there baptizing, in a sense, creating his own mini community of Jews who are saying, repent, the end is near, right? Because here comes the Romans and all these, these terrible things have happened to the temple, right? And all, now these people that you don't think are legitimate are in charge, right? So that you have all this sort of civil and religious upheaval, and then you have the growth of Christianity right out of that. And Jesus fits, remarkably well into that context of a leader in Judaism who focuses on the temple and on God and the Torah, yet is faced with challenges by the Pharisees, a different group within Judaism, the Sadducees, a different group in Judaism, and then even worse, the political power of the Romans, right? What are we supposed to do, Jesus, right? They challenge him with the coin, right? And he says, well, render unto Caesar, right?
What is Caesar's?
Yes. So, you see this constant interplay of the world that Jesus is in is both challenged in religiously locally by his different groups, but challenged politically to take positions too, right? So like think about what's going on when Jesus goes into the temple and he knocks over tables of the money changers. Why is there money changing happening at all? It's because there are foreign powers. Right, you can only use the religious currency of Judaism in the temple, but people are coming from all over, and there are foreign powers there, and you can't use coins with the image of Jesus at the temple. So
it's like a currency exchange. That's all it really was there.
Yeah, but symbolically, if you
I thought they were selling stuff at the.
Well, they were.
Okay.
You could buy things too. If you're gonna make a sacrifice of a dove or something like that, you could buy the dove. But first and foremost, to make any kind of sacrifice and pay at the temple, you had to change it over to the. So yes, but so symbolically, the act of knocking that over is get out of my Father's house, right? But it's a political, religious. Like it's a deep-seated religious position that Jesus takes. It's a powerful symbolic act, but it's also fits very well into the that second temple world of Jesus, where lots of Jews feel disaffected, disconnected, upset with the political circumstances. There's both local political circumstances with the Hasmoneans, but then there's also, they get thrown off. And then by the time of Jesus, it's not just the Hasmoneans, but then it's even more complicated because then it's Herod, right? So King Herod gets his power because he's friends with Caesar Octavian, whose father had helped see Julius Caesar. Like it's really complicated.
Yeah.
But he's sort of the historian of that period, Josephus.
Josephus, who wrote plenty about Jesus. Yeah, extra biblical evidence for Jesus. I always love.
Yeah, Josephus is really important writer of that era. He calls Herod a half Jew, right? He's an Idumean, so he's not exactly Jewish, but he gets into power. He's really not liked. Right. And then he dies right around the time Jesus is born. But then Herod's descendants it's really complicated politically, socially, religiously. And Jesus is born right into that world with a focus, on the temple and on God and on the text. And, but then at the same time, people fairly easily misunderstanding him to be political prophet, somebody trying to disrupt power and things like that, take power for himself, right, and things like that. So, it very much fits. But yeah, that's where all the texts matter, where Josephus matters. We're learning a lot about Rome matters, right? Because you really don't understand Jesus very well if you don't understand first century Roman politics. You just don't, because that everything in that and the Gospels open up for you more if you understand that world. And I mean, that's actually, you asked at the very beginning, how did I get there? I took the Jesus in the Gospels class, but the other class I was taking at the same time that really sort of made it all connect was I was taking a Roman history class. Just a kind of survey of Roman history, just as a history class for another elective for college. And in that class was a block paragraph, probably about this long, right? 10 sentences about a guy named Pompey Magnus. And it's around the year 63 BCE. He just sort of rolls into Judea, right? And kicks out, and the Hasmoneans are like, hey, you're smart. Help us solve this problem we have. He's like, I'll solve it. You're now all Roman. That's basically what Pompey does. And that's a little like block paragraph in my history book. But what happens, the fallout from that in the Jewish world is significant, because all of a sudden the Hasmoneans are thrown off. Then the Herods come, then there's this period of sort of an interregnum with nobody. Then Herod becomes the king. And nobody likes Herod, right? And then things go downhill from there. And then after that, then the Romans try to annex and take total control, right? Thus the taxation part. And then by 70, so about 40 years after Jesus dies, Jesus probably dies in the year 30, by the year 70, the Romans destroy the second temple, and that's never rebuilt. So all that happens in that time, and so does Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and Herod and like all these people, all these historical figures. But all of that Roman political intrigue is having a direct impact on Judea and the world of Jesus, and thus us today, right? Because Christianity is formed in that sort of, and Alexander and all of that is shaped in this small little, in a sense, this tiny little parcel of this rather large Roman Empire is being shaped by these, political battles and civil wars in Rome, but it's having this direct impact on the writers, Jesus himself, his death, the destruction of the temple, and then the destruction of the temple has a massive impact on Jews and Christians going well beyond 70. They're wrestling with the destruction of the temple is a long-standing, cultural, religious sort of, they have to sort of figure out what that means for them going forward. So all of that. So I would say, from a standpoint of the text, if you recognize all of that, it's really difficult both to sort of say the text is absolutely right, the Bible, or to throw it out. Because when you put it in the context of all of this other knowledge that we have, you can see so many things that fit together. It doesn't tell you a certain story, but it tells you that in certain ways you can see that, there's no reason to believe Jesus didn't exist, because he fits it all just fits so well in the world that we now understand better through things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, through archaeology,
right,
through a willingness to learn more about the classical world, the Greco-Roman world and things like that. So
it's so fascinating how well you know your history. It's really incredible.
Well, that was always super interesting to me, and that's how I actually got there. Because the first thing I studied in high school was Latin, and learned all of this kind of foundation of the Roman part of it and the Latin language and all of that. And then, so that's why I had that interest in college. And I'm like, I'm going to take this survey Roman history class. But that was like almost the same day in the classes where there was this little part about Pompey, no big deal, and this massive, thick book about Rome. But in my other class was the events of 63, the arrival of Pompey and, the impact of that, and then Herod. And then just as a side note, Pompey is in the East, the Roman East, but who's in the Roman West? Caesar. Julius Caesar, right? He's developing and growing what we know to be the Roman Empire in Gaul, in France, right? And Pompey is in the West, in Turkey and Israel, and they're growing, they are expanding the Roman Empire at that point, and eventually, because that's the first triumvirate, right? You got Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, right? So that's the lead into Caesar declaring himself to be emperor, right? And the whole change then from the Republic to the Empire is all happening, 50 years before Jesus is born, this massive political shift in the Roman world.
And just and for the sake of, I hate to tie back after you said all that, but do you think if you did interview Jesus, would he keep the Deuterocanonicals in the Bible? And do you think that you should keep the Deuterocanonicals in the Bible?
Do I think Jesus would say keep them? Yeah, I think Jesus he's probably pretty cool with, anything that Jews wrote from that era. Would he say that they had the same weight, or, would Jesus' followers, let's say, hard to speak for Jesus here. But, would people of that era, they would probably say we should keep it, but it's not the same. You can't make the same argument you can make from Genesis or Isaiah or something like. They would say like it's valuable, but it's not the same. So they would probably keep a deuterocanonical status even back then.
Do you think that the apostles believed in a purgatory? Because a lot of the purgatorial evidence comes from Maccabees and the principles taught in it, because they offered sacrifices for the dead and everything, pray for them because...
You mean Jesus' apostles or people of that era? Or
Jesus' apostles, do you think they believed in a necessary purification after the point of death where salvation and entrance into the heavenly body is assured?
My hunch is no, because if they are Jews of that era, the way I think they probably were, following, the Torah as their primary theological base.
Still with knowledge of these books we now call the Deuterocanonicals. So
knowing those books existed, that doesn't necessarily mean they would have swayed their thinking about the sort of nature of the afterlife. I think they would have still focused more on, and let's face it too, the other interesting piece of that is Jesus talking about the kingdom, right? And so the kingdom for them was something to be fairly present, right? That's the other interesting thing about Jesus's language and the Gospels themselves is Jesus's idea of the kingdom and the presence of the kingdom. For me to think about that as they are, disciples of Jesus, I don't know that they would have put anything kind of in between then. They would have said, Jesus says the kingdom is now. And so a purgatory type of thing is not in their theological makeup. Does that make sense? Like,
No, yes, that
yeah,
makes
sort of
sense.
putting anything in between. Now you get distant from that. So, like you get someone like, people who, like, let's say we're Corinthians, and we met Paul, and Paul excited us, and we became Christians, and we're true believers. And then, man, Paul died, and I'm getting pretty old, and Jesus hasn't arrived, right? Christians, I'm not making light of that. Christians really, and they still struggle with that question, because Jesus' return is what it's all really about, right? To sort of the perfection that comes with Jesus' return. And so Christians struggled with that. And so then it becomes more natural, I think, to put different, more complex pieces into your understanding of the heavenly sphere. When there's a delay between sort of, a famous scholar wrote a great book, Now and Not Yet. The idea of the Jesus is saying the kingdom is now, it's in front of you, is what he's saying about himself. And yet it's not yet. That's the way the book of Revelation is so powerful in its own way, because it's saying it happened and it didn't happen yet. And it's coming, but you don't know when. But you have to be ready because it could happen anytime. Like, it's sort of, it's bridging that theological gap that I think a lot of Christians even today feel, right? Between Jesus is sort of, his human, earthly first, existence, and then the return of Jesus, which is what Christians are really expecting, where things are perfected and changed and so on. So it's easier, I think, to plug something in there if you're not in that first age of Jesus and Paul, who think the kingdom is now, right? I think there was a real urgency, and you sense that even in Paul's writing. Early writing. Later you get, I've run the race and things like that, where he's more accepting of, like, okay, I may not see this happen in my earthly life, but he's still resigned to and knows it's going to happen, but he's not seeing it in his own. Where I think Paul's early zeal comes from this expectation that there's going to be a dramatic change in the world, right? Going back to your very first question about God's transcendence. The Christians and Jews of that era, that's a very tumultuous era. They're hoping for change. They want the Romans gone. Like, they want the temple restored and things like that. And so there's a zeal that comes with that I think they're hoping for that. And only over time do they start to plug in a more complex picture of what the heavenly world, as you wait for that, so that's where purgatory comes in. Where do you fit if there's, from a human perspective, thousands of years of gap between Jesus's first and second coming? So I don't know that the early Christians would have held to anything like that. I mean, you can't know, but I don't think so. It wasn't in their Jewish makeup, and it also doesn't fit with that apocalyptic, kingdom kind of worldview that Jesus was teaching. So
fascinating. Do you think there is a purgatory, in your own opinion?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't know. Yeah, those kinds of big questions. I'm not, there's far better theologians in that than I. So, I don't know. I mean,
for me, it seems logically consistent. Nothing unclean shall enter the kingdom of heaven. I mean, Jesus.
Yeah, I mean,
definitely.
I think there's a way theologically you can make pretty good sense of it in because there is this sort of, I mean, there are hints of it even in the biblical text too, right? The saints who are waiting and things like that, right? There's hints that there's people that got to kind of ride this out, you know.
And you can't get out till you pay till the last penny is paid.
Yeah. So theologic, I have no problem with it. Is it real? You're asking somebody who's did most of his writing on angels. So yeah,
and demons, right?
And demons, yeah.
Which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
We might have to do this another time because
okay, yeah,
I would
be
love
great.
to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I would like to talk about that stuff too. So, yeah, probably. I don't know. I don't have a strong sense, but theologically, it's not. Yeah, I agree with you. It's not inconsistent theologically, and maybe it's necessary.
Yes, absolutely.
In the sense of not knowing just how long in human terms these like events are going to be far apart from one another. Maybe that's a necessary part of the the whole God's whole scheme for human history is we got there's kind of a big waiting room. Right.
Well, that's the big thing. A lot of people get caught up on the idea that there's a third location, a third place, heaven, hell, and you're in purgatory, where purgatory is more of a state. I think in the original word for purgatory, whatever that was, maybe it was purgatory. It's a state of cleansing, of purification.
Yeah, and in that sense,
it's refining, really.
Yeah, in that sense, it makes sense. And then if it's a truly metaphysical experience and that's outside of time, then it may not be a problem.
Yeah,
right?
It might not even be an experience really in itself. And also, you could also, if you die, if it's truly outside of time, if you die and someone prays for you in a year, God knew of their prayers a year in the future. It could be applied now, and it's very complicated.
And Revelation plays with that too, right? Because it plays with the sort of past, present, and future as the seer, John, is seeing God. Like I always tell the students, God can, right? Like God can see all of this at once.
Omnipresent, omnipotent, yeah.
Yeah, and so time doesn't really have any meaning for that, for the author and the seer John. He's getting a glimpse into what it means for time to not have any meaning, in the sense of, as linear creatures living in a finite amount of time. It's almost impossible to understand what it would mean to be able to just sort of, point and click and like, okay, what's it going to be in the human year 2580? What's going to happen? Like,
right.
That's what they're giving a glimpse into the idea that God knows all of that, right? It's all, not even that it's a foregone conclusion, but just God can know it. Like that, there's a difference, right? It doesn't have to be all like we're all just, puppets that are just going to do what we're told, because you brought up the question of free will, but that God knows what the outcome will be. I don't think any of the writers at that point had any big problem with that. Like, in fact, I think they were banking on that, right? Because they wanted change in their own world, and they prefer it happen in their own lifetime. Whether it was the kingdom or throwing off the Romans or whatever that would be, or a Messiah to come, right? Jews were talking about a Messiah even before Jesus arrived. And many Jews didn't think Jesus was the Messiah, and that's all fine. But so there were these expectations, but I think all of them are rooted in an understanding that God has a plan and knows what kind of the outcome is, and the good guys are going to win. And so you have to kind of find yourself, on the right side of things, right? Even Paul talks in those kinds of terms, right? As you can, and so did the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, a lot of early Christian, I think, and this goes back to the angels and demons, like there's light and dark. Like you have to work at this, right? You have to strive. Paul's like, I've run the race, right? Like, I've done what I need to do to stay on the correct side of things. Like is no foregone conclusion in this, kind of like you had, talked about your view earlier. It's like, yeah, there's no given in this. There's volition and agency and will. You have to work hard at this, and then hope you're in the right place at the right time, because you can do the wrong thing, and if that's the moment, you're in trouble, right? If you fall off at the wrong moment, and that's the moment you're taken, or the end of the world comes, like, doesn't matter, it doesn't matter what you were doing the rest of the time. Like, you have to work hard at this the whole time. And the reason I think they all believe that is because they believe God's got the plan, and God will ultimately win. But they start then, going to the demons thing and that too. And the idea of Satan, of an adversary, is the world's a pretty messed up place, because God's sort of not letting, but there's this other beings that are kind of running rampant, and humans can make bad decisions, like the priest you mentioned earlier can talk about. So there's a whole slew of reasons that things can go really badly. And the communities are banking on, God's out there and has an ultimate plan, but we got work to do.
Right. Yeah. We have to do our part in that whole thing. And there has to be choice. In order to love God, you have to have the ability to choose not to love and follow God also. It's a law of love in my opinion.
I think both Jesus and Paul would agree with that, right? Because it isn't, for them, they're Jews who are coming out of a Jewish tradition where there's been a great deal of suffering, whether that's the destruction of the temple or anything like, whatever kinds of traditions we want to look at, even back to the Exodus, right? Where they believe that God loves them, that they are a chosen people and things like that. And yet these really tough things happen to them collectively, let alone individually. And so, I don't think any of the, Paul, Jesus's followers, so on, any of them thought you're just in, you had to make some kind of choice, and then, you can be saved, like Paul, by righteousness. And but there's agency. You have to choose to be on the right side, and you have to continue. And I think Paul, more than I think a lot of the Protestant theology will acknowledge, sort of hints at the idea that you kind of have to keep working at it, right? Like, you can't just sort of choose to be in and then you're in. You have to sort of keep working at it collectively as a community.
The old works versus
and
faith
that
alone
may
argument.
oversimplify it, but I think it captures the essence of saying, can you just be saved and then Paul's saying, yeah, you can. But you're saved by entering the Christian community. But I think Paul did not want them. And you see him railing against people in the community who like, well, I'm in. And then they don't do anything, or they do terrible things. And Paul's like, no, like obviously not.
Yeah.
And you see Paul have to speak against that in some responses, like in Corinthians and things like that. He's talking about like, I've heard there's division among you. Like that's like the exact opposite of what Paul's vision for what a community that was working together for Jesus would do. Like we would have arguments about who he's like, some of you are for Peter and some of you are for Jesus and some of you are for Paul. Like, the hell are you doing? Like, he's really up. You can kind of feel in the letter that he's really upset because he's far away and he's getting news that this is what's happening. Right. In fact, in Corinthians, I think it's great because it's a great letter for so many reasons. But one of the things is that it's sort of divided up. Right. So if you read it closely, he says, it's been reported to me that these things are happening. And so for 6 chapters, he's angry and upset and responding to the things that are reported. Then in chapter 7, now concerning the things about which you wrote. Mm-hmm. So which thing matters more to Paul? Not here's our list of questions we want you to answer, Paul. No, it's like, hey, Kevin's what's going on in my, so I come up to Paul like, well, here's their questions, but Paul's like, no, tell me what's going on. And I'm like, well, and then I tell him and Paul gets really upset and for 6 chapters is writing in response to what I told him is happening. Then he's like, then when he calms down and he's done with that, then he's like, all right, give me their list of questions. Then he starts right. So it's like, which one's more important? Paul wants to know what's happening on the ground. Like he'll answer their big theological questions and he does. But for 6 chapters, he's like, I've heard there's divisions. It's, he's all upset and agitated that the things he's hearing about what's going on in his communities are more upsetting than any theological question they could have. And that gives you a great insight into what he's doing because he's not at the community. He's traveled on. He's counting on these, people that travel to and from to bring him letters and so on to tell him what's going on. And he's super upset that there's like...
So it's entirely possible that you could get it wrong and start doing the wrong practices.
Yeah. I'm certain that's Paul went community just petrified that that's what would happen once he left. That's people would kind of go off and then misunderstand what it was brought to them. And I think that's the faith and works thing and everything else. Like, well, I'm saved. I don't have to do anything. And Paul would tell you it's the exact opposite of that.
Fascinating. That's right? Very interesting.
Yeah.
And for the sake of time here, I have a couple more questions that we'll just wrap up real quick.
Okay.
I got to have you on again, but for the sake of this is very fascinating.
Yeah.
I absolutely love this. And by the way, this is the best birthday present ever. Today's my birthday.
Oh, happy birthday. I appreciate you having me on your birthday. That's great.
This is my birthday present to myself because I told people I'm very excited to talk to you about
I hope the listeners and viewers like it because I love talking about this stuff. But you can see where my real the theological abstract stuff is fantastic, but you can see my real knowledge base is Second Temple Judaism, the context of Jesus's life, and then most of my publications are all on angels and some demon stuff and everything. So
we're definitely going to talk about that next time.
Okay, sounds good.
But okay, here is one question I have for you. Mm-hmm. So do you think that as we become more intelligent and we become more enlightened on the metaphysical realities, we start to look into it as more of a serious thing, as people continue asking questions and stuff like that, and we have more intelligent answers, theological answers from people like, I don't know, Bishop Barron and all the people on YouTube, do you think that in America at least, more people are going to come towards believing in philosophies like Christianity, maybe becoming Christian? We also have, I should mention, Jordan Peterson has done a phenomenal job. If you know Jordan Peterson,
yeah,
he's done a phenomenal job of articulating the philosophies taught to us by Old Testament stuff and the Bible as a whole. I'll cut off my question there for Pete's sake. What do you think that more people are going to become Christian as we get more intelligent and learn more?
That's hard to say. I mean, what I'll say is your other point, your original point's a good one because one of my doctoral supervisor, Chris Rowland, was a really smart guy, and so was I had two. Martin Goodman was also very, very, very smart. But one thing I remember from Chris was him telling me that there are very few answers, but there are better questions. So this is after finishing a degree, a dissertation at Oxford, being very humbled by 2 really intelligent guys saying, well, yeah, it's that's good, but we got more work to do. Right. And so to your point about, I think people continue through the gaining knowledge to ask better questions. And in that regard, then I think, yes, it may be the case that people are drawn to revisit Judeo-Christian tradition in light of new knowledge. And so maybe people are brought back, but then if they are in that sort of, a scenario where they're drawn back, then it would be a case that it would look a little different than we're used to. But that's okay, right? Because that really the history of Judaism and Christianity is one of adaptation and growth and development and change.
Deeper understanding,
adapting to the larger culture. And people naturally resist that because they get raised in traditions. But equally, if traditions are going to survive, they absolutely have to adjust to where people are. So I think there's it's a little bit of both and. So I can't say whether more people will or won't, but I think it will bring, new knowledge can bring people back in new ways. And I think we're already seeing that, especially through a lot of scientific knowledge sort of coming back and looking at religion broadly and probably Christianity, specific or Judeo-Christian traditions. So hard to say if that will be the case, but I think you could easily make the argument that when there's new knowledge, you should come back to those traditions. And it would be a shame, regardless of how any of that goes, to just lose all of this knowledge, whether it's religious or historical, right? There's not necessarily right now a great sort of push to learn things historical. There's the idea that you can't really know anything about the past, right? And things like that.
That's pretty annoying. I hear that a lot.
It's frustrating and disappointing to somebody that's spent a lot of their time like me on it. But, at the same time, all this stuff I grant is through my own lens, and I've got my own biases, and so doesn't everyone, but it doesn't mean nothing happened in the past. It doesn't mean there's not valuable knowledge, but maybe you revisit the way in which you try to bring that knowledge forward. Right. And, I think people have reason to be hopeful, but probably it'll look, if it changes and people do come back, it'll look different once they do. Right. Because they'll bring new knowledge, but people shouldn't necessarily be scared of that, because I think there's something to be learned. Like if you know enough about the history of Christianity, you realize Christianity of the first 4 centuries is nothing like the experience of Christians today in modern North America. And there's still something, the thread of that and the core values are still there. But it's changed dramatically as it's moved around the world and moved through time. So why can't that continue to happen and still have it be the same core tradition adapted to the modern, to a postmodern, if you will, world.
Yeah,
so,
if the apostles walked into Eastview Christian Church, they would not feel at home.
No, they'd be pretty confused. Yeah, they'd be they might recognize a cross, Jesus, the name Jesus, but yeah, even if there wasn't a language barrier, right, they wouldn't. Right. There would be very little that would resonate with them, because even to your point, even in creeds and things that we hold, as Christians to be fundamental, they wouldn't know what the heck you were talking about, right? Because those didn't exist for hundreds of years after them. I mean, probably the Our Father's the most likely thing that would resonate, right? Because that's, you're talking about a prayer there that Paul probably knew, goes to the Gospels.
Jesus spoke himself, and they're like, that sounds familiar.
So there's some key things like that, but the way that the liturgy, like you're saying, just the very idea of the physical building separate from like a home or meeting outdoors, to the structure of the liturgy, to reading, they'd probably be astounded you're reading Paul's letters and saying that they're scripture, like Genesis. Like they'd be like, you can't do that. Like they'd be fine with you reading Genesis. They'd be like, why are you reading Paul? this is Paul's letter. They would know it as a letter. They wouldn't know it as scripture. So there's so many ways in which that would be alien to those Christians that, it's okay, that there's these changes over time, because people change and society changes and technology changes, and you adapt the tradition, but you try to keep principles and values and, things like core values. You try to keep those and adapt them to the new context.
And last question here, that's all very fascinating. What would you say to people, because it's really a tragic thing that I've seen plenty of times, to kids who go to college, who grow up with a faith, but they lack proper and deep enough explanation for their beliefs from their parents. They don't explain why they believe stuff. They don't satisfy the curiosity in the questions and the unknown things that their kids have. So when they grow up and they go to college, they're just bombarded with challenges and explanations against their faith and stuff. What would you say to them? I know you're not an evangelist or anything like that, but what would you say to them when they're like, man, there's no good explanations, there's no historical evidence for any of this stuff, it's garbage, I give up? Would you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would ask them to challenge that notion in the sense of, before you sort of give up and assume that what you're told by anybody, you should take at face value, which is, because so in a lot of my classes, I'll start out with the challenge the students with the question, how do we know what we know? Right. And by that, I mean, I've sat and tried to talk about what I understand happened 2,000 years ago in a very different part of the world. Well, how I know that? Texts, archaeology, but also, I've learned it from others and things. So before those folks give up, they should challenge the very notion of how it is that the knowledge they've received came to them. So what I challenge those students with is that, anybody over 40 is in on a big secret that we've all went and changed Wikipedia pages to tell history the way we want to. How would you know I was lying? Well, so then they're like, so they sit and they're uncomfortable for a while. And then they're like, oh, I could look at old newspapers. You got it. You could look at you can go to a museum and look at actual archaeological evidence, right? Things that have been dug up. So there are real artifacts. There are real ways to know at least bits, right, of the past. And so don't take at face value that's why I've been really uncomfortable with dismiss the Bible. Bible is absolutely the word of God. Neither can really, if you sort of really look at what can be known, you're going to have to be pretty uncomfortable with, we can't get it to the word of God. But I think you have to be equally uncomfortable with the idea of jettisoning it entirely. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe you decide personally it doesn't mean anything to you religiously. That doesn't mean it has no cultural value. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be remembered. It doesn't mean it hasn't had an impact on the way our society is now, right? So there's like this middle area where I think we've got to work. And it doesn't have to mean anything to you religiously, but you should do your own. What I would say to them is, you shouldn't accept any premise like that there's not. Now you go decide, like maybe you'll be convinced, but you shouldn't just accept that, and you should do your own reading and thinking. That's what I would say to them. So. Like,
stay skeptical, do your research, make informed decisions.
Yeah, exactly. I think for yourself, right? Think about what matters to you. Why does it matter to you? Is it, what is it that you're looking for from it? Like, is it a sense of community? Is it a sense of spirituality? Is it a sense of just historical knowledge? Like, sort of think about why it's important, then think about how can I gain knowledge in those things, and then make an informed decision. But don't ever just sort of take at face value anything. I think that would be problematic intellectually. And I mean, people would push against that, but like that is like the basic premise of scientific theory, right? Is like you look at the natural world and you make hypothesis and you test it and you retest it. Like, but it starts with questioning, why is that like that? How do we, how can we explain, this phenomenon in the natural world, right? That's the sort of, and so while it's harder, it's still the same intellectual curiosity that drives that. And then you gain what knowledge you can. And then I think maybe it's less, for folks, it's less definitive than physics or mathematics, where you get a right answer or a wrong answer in most cases. But, you push mathematics, you push physics to the theoretical point, and then they start to show, that they can't answer everything either, right? Still trying to get, Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, they're still trying to get those two together. So there are edges to that. Now, they're immensely informative and they're empirical. And so those people, you can be far more comfortable in that lane where there's a lot, but they still push to the edge of where there's still a theoretical component to those two. And I'm not saying they're the same as religion or anything, but that sort of knowledge in the humanities and the social sciences and things like that, yeah, there's necessarily more ambiguity, but I don't know that we're well served by disregarding them either.
Right.
Because I don't know where you can go with just purely empirical, but you can use that same driving curiosity and you can look for connections and links between those, and because they're all part of the human experience. And I don't know, maybe in 2,000 plus years, humans are a-religious as compared to where they were 2,000 years ago or something like that. Okay, well, that's where things adapt to, but hopefully that's an informed decision about a variety of things. But it still doesn't mean there won't be somebody 2,000 years from now saying, it's still worthwhile to study this sort of aspect of the human experience from, 2021. So I hope that they will, keep reading, keep thinking, and then make the decision that's right for them based on that, as opposed to sort of just accepting that there's sort of, you should just be desperate and there's no knowledge to be had. And that's not, neither is there definitive knowledge, neither is there zero knowledge. And I think there's a human instinct to want to either it's from God, so I don't have to think, it's just the right answer, or I just throw it out because I can't figure out how to live with ambiguity. Right. And I think there's, I think most of us are kind of in the middle. Like you, as you invited me on the show, you're doing a lot of thinking about it, and you've got informed, which I appreciate a lot, really informed positions and things, and then probing questions, right? And I think my professor was right. There aren't too many answers. There's just better questions.
I do want to clarify though. I'm not necessarily in the middle. Like I do love to ask questions. I'm devout in my faith.
Yeah, I picked that up, but you're willing to have a conversation.
Oh, you betcha.
And ask questions. Yeah, but I think you're part of why you can be confident in saying you're devout in what you believe in is because you're informed. You read, you think, you're talking to different people, you're constantly thinking, and you're probably adapting as you have these kinds of conversations and you read, you're adapting. Like you're strong in your main convictions, but I didn't know that, and that may change the way that you look at something. So that's what I think folks should try to do.
You can never go wrong. I don't think it can never be detrimental. It can never be a bad thing to pursue truth honestly.
No, I don't think, or even more knowledge, right? Even if you detach it a little from the idea of truth, just being better informed and more knowledgeable, because that's also the basis for being less afraid of other, or fearful of other cultures and things too. The more understanding Christianity is understanding Judaism, right? And for example, right, a lot of Christians probably think they don't know much about Judaism. Surprise, if you're a devout Christian, you do. You don't know it, but when you go to church, a lot of things you say and read and pray about were developed hundreds of years before Jesus was ever born, right? Alleluia, and all these things are Jewish, Jewish ways of worshiping and thinking about God. And so, so those things don't hurt, right? And being better informed about your own understanding of your own faith helps you with understanding a variety of other faiths, or even understanding somebody who says, well, I'm an atheist or whatever. Well, the more you understand your own tradition, the more you can at least understand, why they might differ and what you could say to them if you have a conversation with them. Not even to persuade them, but just say, well, but this is why I believe. Not even trying to change their mind about it, but this is why I do. Does that mean anything to you? That kind of thing. So I think, the pursuit of that kind of knowledge in almost any field just helps you with interacting with people, and to be less, more open and less afraid of interactions and think that you don't know about, other cultures or people. Like that constant quest for knowledge just can benefit everybody, I think.
I agree. And I am with you on everything you're saying. And Dr. Kevin Sullivan, it has been an absolute pleasure
me too.
talking to you today.
No, I haven't. It's been a while since I've been able to, and we went on all kinds of interesting
directions.
We did.
That's kind of my style, I think.
No, that's great. Just like you said, it's a great conversation. So thanks for having me.